July 31st, 1867. The iron rim of a heavy wagon wheel crushed a dry sagebrush into dust as the column of infantry marched slowly away from the wooden stockade of Fort Phil Kearny. Captain James Powell sat stiffly in his saddle, his eyes scanning the ridgelines of the Bighorn Mountains where the gray rock met the hard blue sky. The heat of the Dakota Territory summer pressed down on the shoulders of the 51 men and officers under his command. Sweat stained the blue wool of their uniforms dark under the armpits and down their backs. They walked with their rifles shouldered, boots kicking up a fine alkaline powder that coated their throats and stung their eyes. This was not a combat patrol seeking glory or a diplomatic envoy looking for peace. It was a labor detail, a necessary and dangerous grind to secure the fuel required to keep the garrison from freezing to death when the winter snows eventually buried the Bozeman Trail. The fort they left behind stood as a hated intrusion in the heart of the Powder River country. For months, the Lakota, Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had kept the post under a state of relentless siege. Every man walking in the column knew the history of the ground they trod. Just over the horizon lay the ridge where Captain William Fetterman and 80 men had been lured into an ambush and wiped out to the last man only 7 months prior. The memory of that slaughter sat heavy in the stomachs of the soldiers of Company C, 26th Infantry. They did not speak of it as they marched, but the way they gripped their weapons and the way their heads snapped toward the sound of a snapping twig revealed their tension. The Sioux were not a theoretical enemy here. They were a constant, invisible presence that watched every movement from the high ground. Captain Powell had received his orders earlier that morning from the post commander. His company was to relieve Company A, which had spent the previous month guarding the civilian woodcutters in the pine forest 6 miles northwest of the fort. The rotation was standard procedure, a monthly changing of the guard to keep the troops fresh and to spread the burden of the hazardous duty. Powell was a veteran officer, a man who understood the mechanics of discipline and the reality of his position. He knew that the woodcutters were the most vulnerable targets in the region. The civilian contractors, led by J.R. Porter, were paid to fell the timber and transport it back to the fort, but they could not do it without the protection of the Army. The alliance between the rough-edged civilians and the enlisted men was born of necessity, forged by the mutual threat of the scalping knife. The column moved west along the distinct ruts of the wood road. To their left, the land rose sharply toward the pine-covered slopes of the mountains. To their right, the rolling hills stretched out toward the prairie. The road itself was a scar on the landscape, beaten flat by the hooves of mules and oxen that hauled the heavy wagons back and forth daily. The air smelled of dried grass, pine resin, and the pungent musk of the livestock. A herd of beef cattle moved with the soldiers lowing softly as the drovers kept them in line. These animals were walking rations, intended to feed the men during their month-long stay at the pineries. The noise of the procession was a discordant mix of clanking canteens, the creak of leather harness, and the rhythmic thud of hundreds of feet striking the earth. Lieutenant John Jennis rode near the rear of the formation. He was a younger officer, tasked with ensuring no stragglers fell behind. In this country, a man alone was a dead man. Jennis watched the terrain with the same intensity as his captain. The gullies and ravines that cut through the foothills offered perfect cover for an ambush. A warrior could lie flat in the tall grass 50 yards away and remain completely unseen until he rose to fire. The soldiers kept their formation tight, instinctively bunching together for security, though Powell barked at them occasionally to maintain their spacing. A single artillery shell could not hurt them here, for the enemy had no cannons, but a sudden volley of arrows could devastate a clustered group. They crossed the bridge over Big Piney Creek, the wooden planks rumbling under the weight of the supply wagons. The water below was clear and cold, fed by the melting snows of the high peaks. It was the lifeline of the region, the only reliable source of water for miles. Once across, the road climbed steadily upward toward the plateau known as Piney Island. It was not a true island surrounded by water, but a high, flat triangle of land, wedged between the Big Piney and Little Piney creeks. The terrain here opened up, a grassy meadow surrounded by the dense timber of the lower mountain slopes. This was the workspace, the harvest ground where the contractors felled the lodgepole pines. As they neared the camp, the sound of axes biting into wood echoed off the canyon walls. The relief column saw the smoke of campfires rising in thin gray pillars against the green backdrop of the forest. Company A was waiting for them. The transition was efficient. The tired soldiers of the outgoing unit gathered their gear, their faces showing the relief of men who had survived their 30 days in the kill zone without a major incident. They exchanged brief words with the new arrivals, passing on warnings about recent signs seen near the tree line or the behavior of the local wildlife that might indicate human movement. There was little bravado in these exchanges, only the quiet transfer of survival data. Captain Powell rode forward to inspect the campsite. He was a man of precise habits, and he looked at the layout with a critical eye. The camp was divided into two distinct sections. One belonged to the civilian contractors, a sprawling collection of tents, wagons, and corrals where the teamsters and axemen lived. The other section was the military encampment, set slightly apart to maintain order. The previous commander had pitched the soldiers' tents on an open, level stretch of ground that offered good fields of fire in all directions. Powell approved of the location. It was far enough from the dense timber to prevent a sudden rush from cover, yet close enough to the creeks to allow for easy watering of the stock. The soldiers of Company C began to unroll their blankets and set up their wedge tents. They worked with the practiced economy of men who lived in the field. Canvas was stretched over ridge poles, stakes were hammered into the rocky soil, and gear was stowed. The enlisted men stripped off their heavy coats and rolled up their sleeves, exposing skin to the dry air. They were a mix of veterans and new recruits, immigrants and farm boys, united by the low pay of the frontier army and the shared danger of their assignment. They checked their weapons, immediately wiping down the metal with oily rags to remove the dust of the march. Their rifles were their most possessive items, handled with a reverence that bordered on religious. While the soldiers settled in, the civilian woodcutters continued their work. The sound of the saws was a constant drone. Huge logs were dragged out of the forest by teams of oxen, the heavy chains clanking against the timber. The logs were loaded onto the running gears of the wagons, stripped of their boxes to accommodate the length of the wood. The teamsters cursed at their animals, their whips cracking like pistol shots in the thin air. These men were rougher than the soldiers, bearded and unkempt, wearing a mix of civilian clothes and cast-off military gear. They carried heavy revolvers on their hips and kept carbines leaning against the nearest tree while they worked. They knew the risks as well as anyone. They were paid by the cord, and greed often drove them to push deeper into the woods than was safe. Powell met with J.R. Porter to discuss the security arrangements. The contractor was a pragmatic man who wanted to maximize his profit while keeping his scalp. They agreed on the disposition of the guards. Small detachments of soldiers would be sent out with the wood trains to the cutting sites, while the main body remained at the camp to act as a reserve and to protect the supplies. It was a strategy that stretched the manpower thin. With only 51 men, Powell could not be everywhere at once. He had to rely on the vigilance of his pickets and the speed of his reaction force. He emphasized to Porter that the civilians must stay within sight of the guards and not wander off to hunt or explore. The sun began to dip toward the western peaks, casting long purple shadows across the meadow. The temperature dropped rapidly as the heat of the day radiated back into the atmosphere. The cooks built up the fires, and the smell of salt pork and coffee drifted through the camp. It was the standard ration of the frontier. monotonous but filling. The men lined up with their tin plates and cups, talking in low voices. The topic of conversation was invariably the same: the Sioux. Rumors had been circulating at the fort for weeks about a great gathering of the tribes. The scouts had reported large camps moving north, thousands of warriors converging for a major offensive. No one knew where the blow would fall, but everyone felt the pressure building. As twilight settled over Piney Island, the landscape transformed. The friendly green of the pines turned into a wall of black. The open meadow became a gray sea of uncertainty. Powell ordered the guard to be doubled for the first night. He placed sentries on the perimeter of the camp, men lying prone in the grass with their eyes fixed on the darkness. He walked the line himself, checking each man, whispering orders to stay alert and to fire at anything that did not answer a challenge. The safety of the entire command rested on the eyes and ears of these few men. The livestock were driven into the corrals. The mules and horses were secured, their nervous stamping the only sound in the growing silence. The oxen, more placid by nature, chewed their cud and settled down for the night. The separation between the civilian and military stock was maintained to prevent confusion in the event of a stampede. A stampede was a favorite tactic of the warriors, a way to leave the white men on foot and vulnerable before the main attack. Powell ensured that the picket ropes were tight and that the guards were positioned to watch the animals as closely as the tree line. In the center of the camp, the wagons that were not currently in use for hauling wood were parked in a loose cluster. These were the wagon boxes that had been removed from the running gears to allow the transport of the long logs. They sat on the ground like large wooden coffins, heavy and immobile. At this stage, they were merely storage containers filled with sacks of grain, spare blankets, and tools. They were scattered without a specific defensive plan, just equipment waiting to be used or moved. The soldiers walked past them without giving them a second thought, seeing them only as obstacles to navigate in the dark. Lieutenant Jenness joined Powell by the small fire at the command tent. The two officers drank their coffee in silence, listening to the night sounds. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, wavering cry that was answered by another further up the ridge. Was it a real animal, or a signal between scouts? On the frontier, one could never be certain. Jenness remarked on the clarity of the stars, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a spill of diamond dust. It was a beautiful country, deadly in its grandeur. Powell nodded but kept his thoughts on the tactical situation. He was calculating distances, response times, and angles of fire. He was a professional soldier, and he did not allow the beauty of the night to distract him from the mathematics of survival. The men in the tents tried to sleep. The ground was hard, and the air was cooling fast, requiring them to wrap themselves tightly in their wool blankets. They slept with their rifles next to them, the cold metal barrels touching their sides. It was a comfort and a curse. They were ready to fight in an instant, but the proximity of the weapon was a constant reminder of the threat. Some men snored softly while others lay awake, staring up at the canvas, listening to the wind whisper through the pine needles. Every rustle of the grass outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. Midnight passed, marking the transition to August. The camp on Piney Island was a tiny speck of humanity in a vast, hostile wilderness. The fires burned down to embers, glowing red eyes in the dark. The sentries shifted their weight, their limbs stiffening from the cold. They watched the tree line, imagining shapes moving in the shadows. The fear of the unknown was a physical weight pressing on their chests. They knew the enemy was out there. Red Cloud, the great war chief of the Oglala, had sworn to close the Bozeman Trail and drive the Bluecoats from his land. The wood camp was a thumb in his eye, a provocation that could not be ignored. The isolation of their position became more apparent in the deep hours of the night. Fort Phil Kearny was only 6 miles away, but it might as well have been on the moon. If an attack came, there would be no immediate help. The sound of gunfire might be heard at the post, but it would take hours for a relief column to organize and march. By then, the fight would be over. Powell and his men were on their own. They had to hold the ground with what they had brought with them. The realization settled over the camp, a somber understanding that they were the bait in a trap that had not yet sprung. Around 3 in the morning, a guard thought he saw movement near the creek. He hissed a warning to his partner, and the 2 men brought their rifles up, hammers clicking back. They waited, hearts pounding against their ribs. A deer stepped out of the brush, dipped its head to drink, and then vanished back into the dark. The soldiers exhaled, their breath pluming in the cold air. It was a false alarm, but it served to heighten the tension. There would be no deep sleep for anyone this night. The nerves were too raw, the senses too attuned to danger. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the eastern horizon, the camp stirred. The cooks were up first, rekindling the fires. The smell of coffee once again permeated the air, a signal that another day had begun. The men crawled out of their tents, stiff and groggy, splashing cold water on their faces from the buckets. They looked toward the mountains, checking the ridges for silhouettes. The sun rose, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, burning off the morning mist that clung to the creek beds. It was a deceptively peaceful start to the month of August. Captain Powell emerged from his tent fully dressed and shaved. He checked the roster and issued the orders for the day. The routine would continue. The wood trains would roll, the axes would swing, and the guards would watch. He did not know that the eyes watching him from the high peaks had multiplied during the night. He did not know that runners had been sent to the scattered villages, calling for the warriors to gather. He simply knew that his duty was to hold this ground and protect the workmen. He adjusted his belt, checked the load in his revolver, and walked toward the center of the camp, where the wagon boxes lay scattered on the grass. He looked at them not as storage containers, but with a sudden dawning idea of how they might serve a different purpose in the days to come. August 1st, 1867. The sun crested the eastern ridges, illuminating the high plateau of Piney Island with a harsh, revealing light that exposed every vulnerability of the open camp. Captain James Powell stood in the center of the grassy clearing, his boots planted in the dry soil, surveying the layout of his command. The previous night had passed without incident, but the silence of the surrounding forest did not bring him comfort. It brought a gnawing suspicion. The standard military procedure for a woodcutting detail relied heavily on the mobility of the guards and the intimidation factor of the organized patrols. But Powell looked at the spacing between the tents and the scattered supplies and saw an indefensible sprawl. If the enemy attacked in force, his men would be cut to pieces before they could form a cohesive line of battle. The lesson of the Fetterman disaster was not just about the danger of pursuit. It was about the necessity of a fortified position when facing superior numbers. He made a decision that would alter the geography of the camp and the fate of his men. He called for his first sergeant and ordered the immediate reorganization of the wagon boxes. These were not the canvas-covered prairie schooners often depicted in sketches for Eastern newspapers, but heavy utilitarian wooden transport bodies. They had been lifted off the wheeled running gears to free up the chassis for hauling the massive pine logs. Currently, they lay scattered on the periphery of the camp, used haphazardly for storing grain sacks and camp equipment. Powell ordered them to be dragged to the center of the clearing, a spot of level ground slightly elevated from the surrounding meadow. The work began immediately. It was heavy, back-breaking labor. The soldiers, stripped to their undershirts, grappled with the awkward, boxy structures. Each wagon box was constructed of thick oak and hickory planks, reinforced with iron strapping and heavy bolts. They were 10 feet long and nearly 4 feet high, built to withstand the rigors of hauling tons of cargo over the rough trails of the frontier. Without the wheels, they were dead weight, stubborn blocks of timber that plowed furrows into the earth as the men heaved and shoved them into position. The air filled with the sounds of exertion, the grunt of effort, and the sharp commands of the non-commissioned officers directing the placement. Powell directed the arrangement with the precision of an engineer constructing a redoubt. He did not want a square which would leave blind spots at the corners, nor a loose circle. He ordered the boxes to be placed end to end in a tight oval resembling the shape of an egg. 14 of the heavy boxes were used to form the perimeter. The men shoved them close together, grinding the wood against wood until they formed a continuous wall. At the two ends of the oval, where the curve was sharpest, the gaps were wider. Here Powell ordered the men to pile heavy ox, yokes, logs, and sacks of corn to fill the spaces. The result was a low, crude fortress, a wooden island in the sea of grass. Inside the corral, the space was cramped but functional. It was large enough to hold the entire command if they stood shoulder to shoulder, but the intention was for a smaller defensive force. Powell walked the interior, checking the lines of sight. A man kneeling inside the box would be completely protected from arrows and gunfire coming from the ground level. To fire back, he would have to rise up or bore a loophole through the wood. The men brought augers from the tool wagons and began to drill holes through the heavy sideboards. The oak was dense and seasoned, resisting the bite of the metal bits. Sweat dripped from the soldiers' noses onto the dry wood as they turned the handles, carving out narrow apertures that would allow them to push the barrels of their rifles through the wall without exposing their heads. The civilian contractors watched the activity with a mixture of amusement and appreciation. They were hard men, used to looking out for themselves, but seeing the army build a fixed fortification gave them a sense of reassurance. They continued their work with the teams, driving the oxen back and forth to the tree line, but they kept their eyes on the growing wooden structure. It was a tangible sign that the captain intended to stay and fight rather than run if trouble came. The teamsters threw their bedrolls into the wagon boxes that were not part of the perimeter, using them as makeshift bunks, while the soldiers designated specific boxes for their own gear and ammunition reserves. Once the physical structure was secure, Powell turned his attention to the most critical element of his defense: the firepower. He ordered the crates containing the new rifles to be brought to the center of the corral. These were not the muzzle-loading rifled muskets that had fought the Civil War. Slow to load and prone to fouling, these were the Model 1866 Springfield rifles, known unofficially as the Allen conversions. They represented a technological leap that the warriors in the hills had never encountered. The Army had taken the thousands of surplus percussion muskets and modified them to accept a self-contained metallic cartridge. The soldiers gathered around as the crates were pried open. The rifles smelled of cosmoline and factory oil. The wood stocks were dark walnut, the metal barrels bright and blued. Powell and his sergeants issued the weapons to the men, taking the old muzzle loaders in exchange. For some of the recruits, this was their first time handling the breech-loading mechanism. The system was ingenious in its simplicity. A hinged breech block, the trap door, sat at the rear of the barrel. By thumbing a latch and flipping the block upward and forward, the soldier opened the chamber. Powell initiated a drill immediately. There was no time for leisurely target practice. The men had to learn the rhythm of the weapon until it was muscle memory. "Load!" the sergeant bellowed. The men reached into their cartridge pouches, new leather boxes designed for the specific ammunition, and pulled out a 50-70 government cartridge. It was a copper-cased round, heavy and lethal, containing a 50 caliber soft metal projectile backed by 70 grains of black powder. The soldiers inserted the cartridge into the open breech, the metallic clink audible across the corral. "Close!" The men snapped the breech blocks shut. The cam latch locked the mechanism tight, ready to fire. Fire! They pulled the triggers on the empty chambers, the hammers falling with a heavy mechanical clack. Reload! This was the revolutionary part. The men thumbed the latch, flipping the block open again. An ejector spring built into the hinge popped the imaginary spent casing out of the chamber, clearing the way for the next round. There was no ramrod to pull, no powder to pour, no percussion cap to fumble with. The speed was intoxicating. A trained soldier with a muzzle loader could fire 3 rounds in a minute if he was calm and the barrel was clean about the fouling. With the new Springfield, a man could fire 15, perhaps 20 rounds in the same 60 seconds. It turned a single infantryman into a squad. The men practiced the motion over and over under the midday sun. Flip, insert, snap, click, flip, eject. The metallic rhythm became the heartbeat of the camp. Their thumbs grew sore from the latch, their hands slick with the preservative oil. But their confidence grew with every cycle. They began to understand the power they held in their hands. They were no longer vulnerable targets who had to wait for the smoke to clear to reload. They were engines of continuous fire. Powell walked the line, correcting grips and checking the condition of the weapons. He emphasized the importance of the ammunition. The copper cases were soft. If they were handled roughly or if the chamber was dirty, they could stick. He ordered the men to keep the chambers clean and to carry knives to pry out any stuck casings if the ejector failed. It was a gritty detail, a reminder that even the newest technology had its flaws in the dust and dirt of the frontier. He distributed the ammunition generously. Crates of the 50-70 rounds were opened and stacked inside the wagon boxes. Each man was given a full belt and told where the reserves were. There would be no rationing if the shooting started. As the afternoon wore on, the heat intensified. The air shimmered above the meadow, distorting the view of the distant tree line. The smell of pine resin was thick and heavy. The soldiers broke from their drill to eat a cold lunch of hardtack and water, sitting in the shade of the wagon boxes. They touched the wood of their new fortress, running their hands over the rough grain of the oak planks. The corral felt solid. It was a defined space, a piece of territory that was theirs. The anxiety of the open march faded slightly, replaced by the grim determination of men who had a wall to put their backs against. The civilian wood trains returned from the forest in the late afternoon, the heavy wagons groaning under the weight of the logs. The drivers looked at the finished corral with approval. J.R. Porter, the lead contractor, walked the perimeter with Powell. He saw the logic of the oval. It was compact, easy to defend, and provided a central rallying point for everyone, soldier and civilian alike. The livestock were driven to the stream for water and then corralled nearby, but outside the wagon box perimeter. There was no room for the animals inside the fortress. This space was for men and ammunition only. As evening approached, the sky turned a bruised purple over the Bighorn Mountains. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass of the meadow. The sound was like the whispering of 1,000 voices. The sentries were posted again, moving out into the twilight to take their lonely vigils. Tonight, however, they looked back at the camp and saw the distinct shape of the wagon box corral. It was a dark silhouette against the fading light, an anchor in the wilderness. The men inside spread their blankets on the ground within the oval. It was crowded with 32 soldiers and a handful of civilians sleeping in the confined space. But the proximity was comforting. Powell sat on a crate of ammunition, cleaning his revolver. He watched the men settle down. He saw the new rifles leaning against the sides of the wagon boxes, the metal dull in the gloom. He knew that the Sioux were out there. He had seen the smoke signals rising from the peaks during the day. Thin columns of gray that spoke a language he could not read but understood the intent of. The enemy was gathering. The reorganization of the camp was not an exercise in paranoia. It was a preparation for the inevitable. He hoped the men understood the significance of the drill they had performed all day. Their lives depended not on their courage alone, but on the mechanical efficiency of their hands. The night deepened. The temperature dropped, chilling the sweat on the men's bodies. The moon was a sliver of white, offering little light. The darkness around the corral was absolute. Inside the oval, the breathing of the sleeping men created a soft, rhythmic cadence. Occasionally, a soldier would toss in his sleep, his boots scraping against the wood of a wagon box. The smell of the camp was a mixture of unwashed bodies, tobacco, gun oil, and the dry, dusty scent of the sagebrush. Lieutenant Jennings took the first watch with the perimeter guard. He moved quietly, checking that the men were awake and attentive. He stopped by the wagon box corral and ran his hand along the iron rim of a wheelless hub. The structure felt permanent, rooted to the earth. It was a strange sight, this boat-like assembly of wood floating in the grass, but it was the only piece of civilization for miles. He looked at the loopholes the men had bored. They were dark eyes staring out into the night, waiting for targets. In the early hours of the morning, a wolf howled close to the camp. The sound was sharp and clear, cutting through the silence. A few men sat up, gripping their rifles, their eyes wide in the dark. The howl was not answered. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with intent. The veteran soldiers knew that the animals often moved away when a large number of humans approached. The absence of the usual night sounds, the crickets, the rustle of small game, was more alarming than the noise. The woods were holding their breath. Powell did not sleep. He lay on his blanket, staring at the stars, his mind replaying the defensive plan. He calculated the angles of fire from the oval. The ground to the east was level, offering a clear field of fire for hundreds of yards. To the west and north, the terrain was broken by ravines and gullies that could conceal an approach until the enemy was within charging distance. This was the weak side. He resolved to place his best marksmen on that flank, men who could shoot calm and fast. The new rifles would give them a chance, but only if they held their nerve. The transition from night to pre-dawn was subtle. The black sky softened to a deep indigo. The stars began to fade. The air grew still, the wind dying down as if in anticipation. The date shifted in the minds of the men who were awake to see it. It was now, August 2nd. The routine of the camp began to stir, but it was different this morning. There was a heaviness in the air, a density that pressed against the chest. The men moved with a quiet urgency as they rolled their blankets and reached for their canteens. The soldiers checked their rifles one last time. They opened the breech blocks, ensuring the chambers were clear of grit. They wiped the morning dew from the barrels. They checked their cartridge belts, feeling the weight of the copper rounds. They were ready, or as ready as they could be. The iron oval stood silent, a passive spectator to the dawn. The wood of the boxes was cold and damp. The gaps between the wagons were plugged with the refuse of the camp, creating a jagged, ugly wall. It was not a castle. It was a desperate improvisation, a life raft built of oak and iron. As the light strengthened, revealing the dew sparkling on the grass, the camp appeared deceptively normal. The cooks began to rattle their pans. The teamsters moved toward the herd to yoke the oxen. But the eyes of every man kept flicking toward the tree line, toward the ridges, toward the unseen threat that lay beyond the reach of their vision. The fortress was built. The weapon was ready. Now they could only wait for the hammer to fall. The sun climbed over the horizon line, burning the dew off the high grass of the plateau. It was 7 a.m. The camp on Piney Island operated with the mechanical rhythm of a factory floor, indifferent to the tension that vibrated in the air. The smell of frying bacon and boiling coffee had dissipated, replaced by the pungent odor of oxen manure and dry dust. Captain James Powell watched the deployment of his command with a critical eye. The labor requirements of the day dictated a dangerous splitting of his forces, a tactical necessity that thinned his defensive line to a translucent fragility. He had 51 men on the roster, but the demands of the wood contract scattered them across the landscape like chaff in the wind. The first movement of the morning involved the wood train destined for the fort. 14 heavy wagons loaded high with the timber cut the previous day lumbered out of the camp. They creaked and groaned under the weight, the iron tires grinding against the stones of the road. A small escort of soldiers accompanied them, their blue uniforms dusty and their eyes scanning the ridges. They moved east, putting distance between themselves and the main camp with every revolution of the wheels. At the same time, the empty wagons prepared to head into the timber to harvest fresh logs. This detail required another guard, stripping more rifles from the Central Reserve. Powell authorized the departure, watching the teams of oxen plod toward the dark line of the forest, the drivers cracking their whips and shouting profanities at the stubborn beasts. The pony herd was the next to move. The horses and mules vital for communication and transport needed to graze. A detail of soldiers drove them out of the corrals and toward the slopes near the creek, where the grass was thick and green. This further dispersed the manpower. The camp itself, with the newly constructed wagon box corral, was left with a skeleton crew. Powell stood near his tent, checking the load in his revolver, his senses attuned to the environment. The air was still, lacking even a breeze to stir the pine branches. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that waited to be filled. To the west, where the land rose toward the Bighorns, the terrain was broken by deep ravines and gullies, natural trenches carved by centuries of snowmelt. These depressions were invisible from the camp until one was right on top of them. Inside these earthen scars, hundreds of warriors lay pressing their bodies against the cool soil. They had moved into position during the night, silent as smoke. They were Miniconjou, Sans-Arc, Oglala, and Cheyenne, a coalition of tribes united by a single purpose. They stripped for battle, removing their heavy buffalo robes and leggings, painting their chests with vermilion and yellow ochre. They checked their weapons, bows of ash and hickory, trade muskets, heavy war clubs, and lances tipped with iron. At 9 a.m., the trap sprung. It did not begin with a shout, but with a sudden, violent movement on the periphery. A group of warriors acting as a decoy rode out from the cover of the hills to the north. They charged toward the pony herd, waving blankets and screaming to panic the animals. The soldiers guarding the herd raised their rifles and fired, the white smoke puffing into the clear air. The reports of the gunshots were the signal for the main body. The ravines to the west erupted. It looked as if the earth itself had birthed an army. Hundreds of mounted warriors surged up from the gullies, their ponies kicking up a wall of dust that obscured the sun. The scale of the ambush was immediately apparent. This was not a raiding party of a dozen braves looking to steal stock. This was approximately 1,000 fighting men intent on total erasure. The noise hit the camp a second later. A cacophony of war whistles, high-pitched yips, the thunder of hooves and the deep, throaty roar of the charge. The ground shook under the impact of the ponies. The soldiers at the picket posts fired their weapons, but the incoming tide swallowed them. The warriors swept over the outer defenses like a flood, cutting off the herds and the wood trains from the main camp. The teamsters in the woods saw the attack coming. They were deep in the timber, struggling with the logs when the sound of the engagement reached them. They looked out from the tree line and saw the meadow swarming with enemies. The drivers did not hesitate. They cut the traces of the oxen, abandoning the wagons and the valuable timber. Panic took hold. These were civilians, not soldiers, and their instinct was self-preservation. They scrambled onto the backs of the horses or ran on foot, diving into the dense underbrush to hide. The warriors pursued them into the trees, their ponies weaving through the pines with terrifying agility. Arrows hissed through the branches, thumping into wood and flesh. The scene at the pony herd was chaotic. The stampede was successful. The terrified mules and horses broke away from the guards, galloping wildly toward the open prairie, driven by the shouting warriors. The soldiers who had been guarding them were now fighting for their lives in the open. They fired their muzzle loaders. Some had not yet been issued the new Springfields and tried to reload while running. It was a futile effort. The mounted warriors closed the distance instantly, striking down the running men with clubs and lances. The dust swirled around the melee, creating a localized storm of violence where blue coats and painted skin clashed in a blur of motion. Powell, standing in the center of the wagon box corral, saw the disaster unfolding. He did not panic. His training took over, his mind organizing the chaos into a series of necessary actions. He saw the wood train coming down from the timber, the drivers whipping the oxen into a lumbering run. The warriors were flanking them, pouring arrows into the sides of the beasts. One wagon overturned, spilling its load of logs and crushing the driver beneath the wreckage. The others veered off, the men abandoning the slow-moving vehicles to sprint for the safety of the corral or the distant fort. The warriors did not immediately assault the wagon box circle. Their focus was on the easy prey, the scattered groups, the livestock, and the supplies. They looted the abandoned wagons, slashing open sacks of grain and setting fire to the canvas covers. Thick black smoke began to rise, joining the dust to darken the sky. The smell of burning wood and hair drifted across the meadow. The warriors rode circles around the burning wagons, celebrating their initial success, their confidence soaring. They believed the soldiers were broken, scattered, and helpless. However, amidst the rout, small groups of men were fighting their way back to Powell. The pickets who had survived the initial rush conducted a fighting retreat. They utilized the terrain, dropping behind rocks and logs to fire, then running a few dozen yards to the next cover. The new breech-loading rifles began to speak. The sharp crack, crack, crack of the rapid fire surprised the warriors who tried to run them down. A brave would charge a soldier who had just fired, expecting him to be helpless while reloading, only to be met with another projectile 3 seconds later. This unexpected resistance bought the survivors precious time. One group of woodcutters and their escort found themselves cut off completely from the corral. They were closer to the road leading to the fort. Seeing that they could not breach the wall of warriors between them and Powell, they made the decision to run for the post. It was a 6-mile gauntlet of death. They moved in a tight knot, firing outward, keeping the warriors at bay with a hedge of bayonets and slugs. The warriors harassed them, riding in close to loose arrows and then darting away, but they did not press the attack home, preferring to focus on the looting of the camp and the preparation for the main assault on the corral. Inside the wagon box oval, the situation was frantic. Powell shouted orders to the men who remained. They had to secure the perimeter before the main wave hit. Soldiers ran to the gaps between the wagons, throwing sacks of corn and beans into the openings to build up the barricades. They dragged crates of ammunition to the firing line, prying the lids off with bayonets. The copper cartridges spilled out onto the blankets, glittering in the filtered sunlight. There were 32 men in the corral now, officers, enlisted men, and a few civilian teamsters who had made it inside. They were the remnant, the hard core that remained after the outer layers had been peeled away. The warriors began to congregate on the high ground surrounding the camp. They stopped their looting and turned their attention to the strange wooden structure in the center of the meadow. They saw the blue caps of the soldiers bobbing above the wagon sides. They saw the barrels of the rifles protruding from the loopholes. To the Sioux and Cheyenne, this looked like a trap they had already sprung. They had captured the herd, burned the trains, and killed the stragglers. The few men left in the boxes were merely the final course of the meal. The chiefs, Red Cloud, High Backbone, and others, rode along the lines of their men, organizing them for the final blow. They did not know about the new rifles. They saw only a handful of frightened white men hiding in wooden boxes. The brutality of the morning was evident in the bodies that littered the meadow. A soldier from the herd guard lay face down in the sagebrush, his back bristling with arrows. A teamster caught in the open near the timber had been stripped and mutilated, his body a testament to the rage of the attackers. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded oxen that had been hamstrung and left to suffer. The cruelty was not a byproduct of the battle. It was a tactic, a weapon used to instill terror in the survivors. The sights and sounds of the torture were designed to break the will of the men in the corral, to make them hold their fire and wait for the end. But the effect on Powell's men was the opposite. The sight of their comrades falling and the knowledge of what awaited them if they surrendered hardened their resolve. There was no talk of parley. There was no thought of escape. The world had shrunk to the interior of the wagon box corral. The only reality was the wood, the iron, the cartridges, and the enemy. The men stripped off their coats and hats, tying handkerchiefs around their heads to keep the sweat from their eyes. They arranged their ammunition in neat rows on the ground beside them, easy to reach. They checked the sights of their rifles, adjusting for the range where the warriors were gathering. The dust cloud settled slightly, revealing the sheer magnitude of the force arrayed against them. The slopes were covered with men and horses. It looked as if the entire Sioux nation had descended on Piney Island. The colors were vibrant, the red and blue trade cloth, the white eagle feathers, the painted ponies. It was a magnificent, terrifying spectacle. The warriors began to sing their war songs, a low, rhythmic chanting that grew in volume until it drowned out the cries of the wounded. They beat their bows against their shields, creating a rolling thunder that vibrated in the chests of the soldiers. Powell walked among his men, his voice calm and steady. He did not make a speech. He simply assigned sectors of fire. He told them to pick their targets. He told them not to fire until he gave the order. He reminded them of the drill: load, lock, fire, eject. The mechanics of the action were their salvation. He looked at the civilians who had joined them. Some were old hands, armed with Spencer carbines or double-barreled shotguns. Others were shaking, their faces pale, beneath the dirt. Powell placed them between the veterans, anchoring them with the presence of steady men. The sun continued its ascent, moving toward its zenith. The heat began to build, baking the moisture out of the ground. The interior of the corral, shielded from the wind by the wagon boxes, became an oven. The smell of the unwashed bodies and the fierce sweat became pungent. Flies, attracted by the blood on the field, began to buzz around the faces of the defenders. It was a small, irritating detail that added to the misery of the situation. The warriors on the hill stopped their chanting. A single rider moved forward, raising his lance high in the air. He was a leader, a man of status. He shouted a command that carried across the distance. The mass of warriors began to shift, to align themselves. They were forming up. The chaotic swirling of the ambush phase was over. The organized assault was about to begin. The ambush had been the opening move, a violent stripping away of the camp's defenses. Now came the crushing weight of the main army. Powell checked his watch. It was nearing the middle of the morning. In less than 2 hours, his command had been reduced from a functioning military unit to a beleaguered knot of survivors. The wood trains were gone. The herds were gone. The communication with the fort was cut. He was the commander of a wooden island in a sea of hostility. He looked at the faces of his men. They were grim, set in lines of hard determination. They knew the odds. They knew the history of this ground. They knew that no one had survived the Fetterman fight. They tightened their grip on the stocks of their rifles. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of the intake of breath before the scream. The warriors on the slopes lowered their lances. The ponies pawed the ground, sensing the tension of their riders. The dust hung in the air, a golden haze that filtered the light. The stage was set. The ambush was complete. The siege of the wagon box corral was starting. Powell stepped to the side of a wagon box, looked through a gap in the wood, and waited for the wave to break. The dust from the initial ambush still hung in the air, a choking yellow curtain that obscured the view of the distant tree line. Inside the wagon box corral, the soldiers of Company C waited with their chests heaving, their eyes stinging from the grit. The immediate roar of the initial assault had faded into a series of sporadic, triumphant yips from the ridge, leaving a vacuum of silence in the meadow. It was in this brief interlude that the last survivors made their desperate bid for the sanctuary of the wooden oval. From the direction of the timber, 3 men emerged from the brush. They were soldiers who had been part of the wood train escort, cut off when the wagons were overrun. They had abandoned the slow-moving ox teams and sprinted through the ravines, staying low to avoid the mounted warriors who were busy looting the captured supplies. Now they faced the final 200 yards of open ground. The grass here was knee-high, brown, and brittle, offering no cover. They rose from the earth and began to run. Captain James Powell saw them instantly. He did not shout, for his voice would carry to the enemy, but he gestured frantically to the men on the north side of the perimeter. "Cover them!" he hissed. The soldiers inside the corral pushed the barrels of their Springfields through the loopholes. They held their fire, waiting for a target to present itself. The running men were exhausted. Their mouths hung open, gasping for air that felt like hot wool in their throats. They carried their rifles in one hand, their other arms pumping to drive their heavy legs forward. They stumbled over sagebrush roots, caught their balance, and kept moving. A group of 5 warriors mounted on painted ponies spotted the runners. They broke away from the looting of the tents and spurred their mounts into a gallop. They closed the distance with terrifying speed, their ponies eating up the ground. The warriors leaned low over the necks of their animals, presenting a small target. They did not fire immediately. They wanted to get close enough to use their lances or war clubs. It was a race between the exhausted infantrymen and the fresh horses. "Fire!" Powell commanded. The north side of the wagon box corral erupted. A dozen rifles cracked in unison. The white smoke billowed out from the loopholes, obscuring the view for a fraction of a second. The volley was ragged but effective. One of the ponies went down, tumbling head over heels and throwing its rider into the hard dirt. Another warrior jerked backward, clutching his shoulder, and turned his mount away. The remaining 3 veered off, startled by the volume of fire coming from what they thought was a defenseless camp. The shock of the breechloaders checked their charge just long enough. The 3 runners reached the perimeter. They did not stop to look for a gate. They threw themselves over the sides of the wagon boxes, tumbling onto the blankets and ammunition, crates inside. They lay there for a moment, coughing and retching, their bodies shaking from the adrenaline dump. Their uniforms were torn, their faces streaked with sweat and dirt. Hands reached out to pull them down, to check them for wounds. They were unhurt, save for the scrapes and bruises of their flight. They were the last ones. No one else was coming out of the timber. Powell wasted no time. "Close it up," he ordered. "Seal the gaps." The entrance to the corral, a wide opening at the western curve of the oval, was still vulnerable. The men rushed to fill it. They did not have a gate. They had to build a wall. They dragged heavy ox yokes from the center of the corral. These were massive pieces of carved hickory reinforced with iron rings used to couple the oxen together. They were heavy, awkward burdens that required 2 men to lift. The soldiers threw them into the gap, stacking them one on top of another. Next came the log chains. These were thick lengths of iron links used for hauling timber. The men looped them through the wheels of the wagon boxes on either side of the opening and stretched them across the gap, creating a web of metal. They piled sacks of grain against the yokes, banking them up to create a solid breastwork. The sacks were heavy with corn, acting as sandbags that could stop an arrow or a musket ball. The men worked with a frantic energy, their knuckles white as they gripped the rough burlap. They threw saddles, crates of hardtack, and even their own bedrolls into the breach. Anything that could stop a projectile was utilized. Within 10 minutes, the oval was a continuous, unbroken fortification. There was no way in and no way out. The 32 men inside were now sealed in a wooden vessel, adrift in a hostile ocean. Powell walked the perimeter, checking the integrity of the barrier. He pulled on the chains, kicked the sacks of grain, and peered through the chinks in the logs. It was crude, ugly, and low, but it was solid. The wagon boxes themselves were the main wall. The hickory planks were 1.5 inches thick, strong enough to turn a standard arrow or a glancing ball, but they would not stop a direct hit from a heavy buffalo gun. Powell turned his attention to the human element. He needed an exact count. He moved from box to box, tallying the defenders. There were 26 soldiers from Company C. There were 6 civilians, contractors, and teamsters who had chosen to stand with the army rather than risk the run to the fort. 32 men. That was the total strength of the garrison. Against them stood an army that the scouts estimated at nearly 1,000 warriors, perhaps more. The arithmetic of the situation was bleak. Each man inside the corral would have to account for 30 of the enemy just to break even. The distribution of the men was the next critical task. The wagon boxes were not evenly spaced. The oval was long and narrow. Powell placed his men to maximize the firepower on the most vulnerable approaches. The ends of the oval, the curves, were the weak points where a crossfire could be established by the enemy. He placed his steadiest veterans there, men who had seen combat before and would not flinch when the rush came. Lieutenant John Jennis took command of the northern sector. He was young, but he carried himself with a calm authority that steadied the nerves of the recruits. He moved along the line, ensuring that every man had a comfortable firing position. The soldiers sat or knelt on the bottom of the wagon boxes. The height was awkward. If they stood, they were exposed from the waist up. If they knelt, they had to cant their rifles upward to shoot through the loopholes bored in the top boards. To solve this, the men improvised. They dragged the sacks of corn and flour from the center of the corral and placed them inside the boxes to serve as firing steps. A man could kneel on a sack and have his shoulder level with the loophole. Others used their blankets to create padded rests for their rifles. The interior of the boxes became a cramped nest of equipment and humanity. The space was tight. In some boxes, 3 men were shoulder to shoulder, their elbows bumping as they adjusted their gear. The civilians were integrated into the line. Among them was an old frontiersman named Haggerty. He carried a heavy octagon-barreled hunting rifle and wore buckskins that were black with grease and age. He did not need orders. He found a spot on the southern perimeter, settled himself on a crate, and began to arrange his shooting patch and powder horn. He looked at the soldiers with their new breech loaders with a skeptical eye, but he said nothing. He was a professional survivor, and he knew that today the volume of fire would matter more than precision. Another civilian, a teamster known only by his surname Daly, had a Spencer carbine. This was a 7-shot repeater, a weapon that fed from a tubular magazine in the stock. It was a potent firearm for close-range work. Powell placed him near the makeshift gate where the fighting would likely be hand-to-hand if the perimeter was breached. Daly checked the magazine tube, sliding it out to ensure the copper rimfire cartridges were aligned correctly. His hands shook slightly, but his face was set in a grimace of determination. The environment inside the corral began to change as the sun climbed higher. The heat trapped within the wooden walls intensified. The air grew still and heavy. The smell of the raw pine of the wagon boxes mixed with the scent of gun oil and the sour odor of fear sweat. Flies, thousands of them, descended on the corral. They were aggressive, biting flies that buzzed around the eyes and ears of the men. The soldiers swatted at them, cursing in low voices. It was a grotesque annoyance in the face of death. Powell ordered the ammunition to be uncrated and distributed fully. There would be no hoarding. He wanted every man to have at least 100 rounds within arm's reach. The wooden crates were pried open, the nails screeching as they were pulled. The heavy cardboard packets of 50-70 cartridges were ripped apart, and the shiny copper rounds were poured into hats, onto blankets, and into the pockets of the men. The floor of the wagon boxes glittered with the metallic promise of violence. The men also prepared their reserve weapons. Many of the soldiers had managed to grab a second rifle during the confusion, or had taken one from the wounded. These were loaded and placed carefully against the side of the box, ready to be grabbed if the primary weapon jammed or overheated. Revolvers were taken out of holsters and placed on the sacks, hammers down on empty chambers but ready to be cocked. Knives were loosened in their sheaths. The view from the loopholes was a panorama of destruction. The warriors had finished looting the tents of the main camp, which stood only a few hundred yards away. They were now systematically dismantling the site. The soldiers watched as their personal belongings, letters from home, spare uniforms, photographs, were scattered in the dirt or held up as trophies. The tents were cut to ribbons, the canvas flapping in the slight breeze. The smoke from the burning supply wagons drifted across the field, stinging the eyes of the defenders. It was a psychological blow intended to show the soldiers that their world had been erased. There was no camp to go back to. There was no shelter. There was only the wood they stood behind and the ground they stood on. The warriors began to taunt them. They rode their ponies back and forth just out of effective range, shouting insults in Sioux and Cheyenne. They made gestures, drawing their hands across their throats. They held up items they had taken from the dead bodies of the wood train escort, a bloody tunic, a scalp lock. The reaction of the soldiers was a cold, hardening anger. The fear that had made them tremble during the run to the corral was replaced by a singular focus. They stopped looking at the destruction and started looking at the sights of their rifles. They began to calculate windage and elevation. The abstraction of the enemy vanished. These were men who were killing their friends and burning their homes. The soldiers wanted to shoot. Powell sensed the shift in the mood. He moved to the center of the corral where he could be seen by most of the men. He did not stand tall. That would be suicide. He crouched low, turning his head to address the perimeter. "Men," he said, his voice level and devoid of panic. "We are in a tight spot. But we have the best position on the field. We have the new rifles, and we have enough ammunition to kill every one of them twice over." He paused, looking at the young faces of the recruits and the bearded faces of the veterans. "Do not throw away your shots. You have to hit what you aim at. If they charge, shoot the horses first. A man on foot is slower than a man on a pony. Keep your heads down. Stay behind the wood, and if the gun jams, use your knife to clear it. Do not stop firing." He did not promise them rescue. He did not tell them that help was on the way. He treated them like men who understood the reality of the frontier. They were alone. Their survival depended entirely on their own discipline. The soldiers nodded. They understood. They turned back to their loopholes, settling their cheeks against the stalks of the spring fields. The silence outside began to change. The taunting stopped. The warriors were pulling back, regrouping on the ridges. The individual riders who had been showing off their horsemanship trotted back to the main body. The mass of the enemy began to coalesce. It was like watching water gather before a dam breaks. They were organizing. The chiefs were riding along the lines, their feathered bonnets distinct against the skyline. They were arranging their forces for a coordinated blow. Inside the corral, the waiting was the hardest part. A soldier named Doyle, a young private from Ireland, wiped his palms on his trousers. They were slick with sweat. He gripped his rifle again, testing the friction. He looked at the man next to him, a corporal named Grady. Grady was chewing a plug of tobacco, his jaw working rhythmically. He looked bored, but his eyes were sharp. "Easy, lad," Grady whispered. "Just like drill. Load, lock, fire." The sun beat down. The temperature inside the wagon boxes rose past 100 degrees. The heat radiated from the wood, baking the men. Their wool uniforms felt like heavy blankets. Sweat ran down their backs and into their boots. They were thirsty, but no one reached for a canteen. To drink now would be to admit weakness. They conserved their movement. Powell checked the perimeter one last time. The yokes were solid, the chains were tight, the grain sacks were piled high. The men were set. He took his own position at the eastern end of the oval, where he had a view of the open plain. He drew his revolver and placed it on a crate. He picked up a Springfield rifle he had reserved for himself. He opened the breech, checked the shiny copper base of the cartridge, and snapped it shut. The click was loud in the stillness. The first sign of the assault was a low rumble like distant thunder. It was the sound of thousands of hooves striking the earth. Then came the dust, a rising wall that obscured the base of the hills. And then, the voice of the enemy. It was a single unified cry that rose from 1,000 throats, a sound of pure, primal aggression. The warriors crested the ridge. They did not come in a disordered mob this time. They came in a wave, hundreds of mounted men riding knee to knee, their ponies at a full gallop. They were 500 yards away and closing fast. The ground shook. The sight was overwhelming. It was a moving wall of muscle, paint, and iron. "Steady!" Powell's voice cut through the noise. "Steady, men! Wait for the command!" The soldiers pressed, their shoulders into the rifles. They squinted through the loopholes. The front sights of their weapons settled on the chests of the ponies or the painted torsos of the riders. The distance closed. 400 yards, 300. The details became clear. The expressions on the warriors' faces, the foam on the ponies' mouths. The vibration of the charge traveled through the ground and into the wood of the wagon boxes. The defenders could feel it in their knees. It was a physical force, a pressure wave of violence. The impulse to fire early was overwhelming, the desire to push back against the incoming tide. But they held. They trusted Powell. They trusted the wood. 200 yards. The archers among the Sioux raised their bows. The first arrows began to arc through the sky, falling like rain toward the oval. They thudded into the ground, into the sacks of grain, into the wood. Thwack, thwack, thwack. "Ready?" Powell called out. The hammers of 32 rifles clicked back to full cock. The sound was a crisp mechanical ripple that defied the roar of the charge. The index fingers tightened on the triggers. The seal was tight. The perimeter was set. The fortress of the plains was about to be tested. "Fire!" Captain Powell's command was not a scream, but a sharp, guttural bark that cut through the thunder of the approaching hooves. At the exact moment the syllable left his lips, the eastern face of the wagon box corral transformed from a silent wooden barricade into a mechanism of eruption. The hammers of the Springfield rifles fell, striking the firing pins with a synchronized metallic clack that was instantly drowned out by the collective roar of the discharge. A sheet of flame, orange and ragged, burst from the loopholes, instantly followed by a dense white cumulus of black powder smoke that obscured the sunlight. The recoil kicked hard against the shoulders of the defenders, driving the wooden stocks into their bruised muscles. The effect on the charging wave of Sioux and Cheyenne was immediate and catastrophic. At 200 yards, the heavy .50 caliber slugs slammed into the front rank of the ponies and riders with the force of sledgehammers. The soft metal projectiles flattened on impact, shattering bone and tearing through muscle. Ponies tripped over their own legs, tumbling forward in violent somersaults that crushed their riders beneath half a ton of horseflesh. Warriors were thrown from their mounts, their bodies cartwheeling through the air before hitting the hard-packed earth. The momentum of the charge, which had been building like a tidal wave, hit an invisible reef of high-velocity metal. In the past, this would have been the moment of vulnerability for the soldiers. The warriors, trained in the rhythm of fighting muzzle loaders, expected a long pause, 20 to 30 seconds of silence while the bluecoats reached for powder flasks and ramrods. They expected to close the remaining distance during this interval, to ride right up to the wagon boxes and fire their arrows point blank or leap over the sides with war clubs. The warriors in the second rank spurred their ponies, screaming their war cries, anticipating the slaughter of helpless men fumbling to reload. But the silence never came. Inside the corral, the drill that Powell had instilled in his men took over with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. There was no fumbling for ramrods. There was no pouring of powder. The soldiers reached up with their thumbs, unlatched the breech blocks of their Allen conversions and flipped them forward. The ejectors snapped back, kicking the hot, empty copper casings out of the chambers. The brass cylinders spun through the air, clinking against the other shells piling up on the blankets. In the same motion, hands reached into the open crates or cartridge belts, grabbed fresh rounds, and shoved them into the smoking breeches. The blocks were snapped shut. The hammers were pulled back to full cock. 3 seconds after the first volley, the rifles roared again. The second volley caught the warriors completely off guard. The riders who had surged forward to exploit the expected gap in the fire were met with a fresh wall of projectiles. The confusion in the charging ranks was absolute. Horses, maddened by the noise and the scent of blood, reared and shied, colliding with the mounts behind them. The charge lost its cohesion. Instead of a unified wave, it became a chaotic jumble of rearing animals and falling men. The air above the meadow filled with the screams of wounded horses, a sound that pierced the ears even through the deafness caused by the gunfire. Inside the wagon boxes, the soldiers worked like automatons. They did not aim for specific individuals so much as they aimed at the mass of brown and red that filled their vision. The targets were so dense that it was impossible to miss. They fired, reloaded, and fired again. The noise inside the corral was a continuous, deafening roar. The smoke from the black powder did not clear. It hung in the heavy air, trapped by the walls of the wagon boxes. It grew thicker with every shot, a sulphurous fog that stung the eyes and coated the throats of the men with a gritty, foul-tasting residue. Visibility dropped to near zero, but they kept firing into the gray haze, aiming at the dark shapes that loomed out of the smoke. On the northern perimeter, Lieutenant Jennis moved behind his men, shouting to be heard over the din. He directed their fire toward the flanks where the warriors were trying to peel away from the carnage in the center. He saw a group of riders trying to circle around to the rear, hoping to find a weak spot. "Left oblique," he roared. The soldiers shifted their knees on the grain sacks, traversed their rifles, and poured a withering fire into the flanking party. The heavy slugs punched through the timber of the wagon boxes where the soldiers rested their barrels, creating splinters. But the incoming fire from the warriors was largely ineffective against the low, protected positions of the defenders. The sheer volume of fire generated by the 32 men was unprecedented in the history of the Plains Wars. A single muzzle loader could put one round downrange every 45 seconds. These men were putting 15 rounds downrange in the same amount of time. Multiplied by 30 rifles, the corral was spewing nearly 450 rounds a minute. It was a machine gun made of human hands and single-shot rifles. The air in front of the corral was saturated with hot metal. The ground churned as bullets that missed their targets plowed into the dirt, kicking up geysers of dust that mixed with the smoke. The warriors could not get closer than 50 yards. The wall of fire was physically impenetrable. A brave named Little Horse mounted on a fast gray pony tried to break the deadlock. He whipped his animal, lying flat along its neck, and drove straight for the gap between two wagon boxes where the ox yokes were piled. He made it to within 30 yards before his pony simply collapsed mid-stride, riddled with half a dozen hits. Little Horse was thrown, clear, rolling in the dust. He scrambled to his feet, stunned by the intensity of the noise, and ran back toward the ravine, weaving and dodging as bullets slapped the ground around his moccasins. The heat inside the wagon boxes became infernal. The barrels of the rifles grew too hot to touch. The soldiers wrapped their handkerchiefs or torn pieces of their shirts around the metal to protect their hands. The heat waves radiating from the steel distorted the air, making the targets dance and shimmer in the sights. The smell of burning wood joined the stench of sulfur as the hot barrels scorched the pine planks of the wagon boxes where they rested. The grease on the action sizzled, yet the mechanisms held. The trapdoors continued to flip, eject, and lock. The teamsters fighting alongside the soldiers added their own contribution to the chaos. Daly, with his 7-shot Spencer carbine, fired until the magazine tube in the stock was empty. He pulled the follower out, dropped 7 fresh copper cartridges into the butt, and resumed firing in seconds. His rate of fire was even faster than the Springfield's, though his range was shorter. He swept the area directly in front of the makeshift gate, creating a localized kill zone that no warrior could enter and live. The brass casings from his carbine piled up around his boots, glittering in the gloom of the smoke. Haggerty, the old frontiersman, took a different approach. He did not fire rapidly. He waited for the smoke to thin for a fraction of a second, picked a specific target, a chief wearing a war bonnet or a warrior rallying the others, and squeezed the trigger of his heavy rifle. His shots were deliberate and lethal. Every time his rifle boomed, a man on the ridge dropped. He was calm, chewing on a piece of tobacco, seemingly immune to the panic and adrenaline that fueled the younger men. He wiped his eyes with the back of a dirty hand and searched for the next target. Outside, the charge began to disintegrate. The horses, more sensible than the men, refused to advance into the noise and pain. They wheeled away, fighting the bits, turning their rumps to the fire. The warriors, realizing that a frontal assault was suicide against this new medicine, began to pull back. They did not rout. They flowed away like water receding from a shore. They rode back toward the safety of the ravines and the high ground, leaving the meadow littered with the bodies of their dead and wounded. As the firing slackened, the smoke began to drift upward, revealing the aftermath of the first 10 minutes of combat. The field in front of the corral was a landscape of horror. Dozens of ponies lay dead or dying, their bodies dark mounds in the yellow grass. Among them lay the bodies of the warriors. Some were still moving, trying to crawl away. Others lay still. The ground was streaked with red. The dust was settling, coating the dead in a fine gray shroud. "Cease fire," Powell ordered. "Cease fire! Conserve your ammunition." The command rippled down the line. The soldiers lowered their rifles, their chests heaving as if they had just run a mile. Their faces were blackened with powder residue, leaving only the whites of their eyes and the pink of their tongues visible. They looked at each other, stunned by their own survival. They checked their ammunition belts. They had burned through hundreds of rounds in minutes. The floor of the wagon boxes was carpeted with spent casings. The metal was hot against their legs. Powell moved quickly to check the perimeter. "Is anyone hit?" he asked. Miraculously, the answer was largely negative. A few men had splinters in their faces from bullets striking the wagon sides. One man had a bruise on his shoulder that was turning purple from the recoil, but no one was dead. No one was bleeding out. The low profile of the wagon boxes and the sacks of grain had protected them perfectly. The warriors firing from the backs of moving ponies had sent their arrows and bullets high, passing harmlessly over the heads of the defenders. The silence that followed the roar was heavy and unnatural. It was broken only by the groans of the wounded men and horses on the field and the metallic clicking of the soldiers reloading their weapons. They topped off their magazines and chambers, replacing the spent rounds. They drank from their canteens, the tepid water washing the taste of saltpeter from their mouths. They did not celebrate. They knew this was only the first wave. On the ridge, the Sioux and Cheyenne leaders were holding a council of war. They were shocked. They had never seen firepower like this. They discussed the bad medicine of the wagon boxes. They argued about tactics. Red Cloud, watching from a high vantage point, saw that the direct mounted charge was useless. The Bluecoats could shoot too fast. They needed to change their approach. They needed to use the terrain. They needed to get close on foot where the rifles would be less effective and where their numbers could overwhelm the tiny garrison. The warriors began to dismount. They handed their ponies to the horse holders in the rear. They stripped off their remaining heavy gear. They took up their rifles and bows and began to move into the tall grass and the ravines that snaked toward the corral. They would crawl. They would snipe. They would creep closer inch by inch until they were right under the noses of the soldiers. Inside the corral, the soldiers used the lull to cool their weapons. Some men poured a little water from their canteens onto the barrels, the liquid hissing and steaming as it hit the hot metal. They wiped the actions with oily rags, clearing the black sludge of fouling that had accumulated. If the breech blocks stuck, they would be dead. They worked the mechanisms, ensuring they were smooth. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound was reassuring. Powell looked at the sun. It was still morning. They had survived the first hour. But the day was long and the enemy was adapting. He saw the movement on the ridges. He saw the warriors getting off their horses. He knew what was coming next. The easy targets were gone. The next phase would be a slow, grinding battle of attrition. "Watch the grass," Powell warned his men. "They are coming on foot. Keep your heads down. Don't fire unless you see a target." The soldiers peered through the loopholes. The smoke had mostly cleared, leaving a blue haze over the meadow. The sun beat down, heating the interior of the corral again. The adrenaline crash began to set in, leaving the men feeling heavy and tired. Their hands shook slightly as they gripped their rifles. They waited. A single shot rang out from a ravine 300 yards away. A bullet thwacked into the side of a wagon box, burying itself in the oak planking inches from a soldier's head. Then another shot, then another. The sniping had begun. The warriors were finding their range. They were using the cover of the terrain to pour a steady, harassing fire into the corral. The wall of fire had stopped the charge, but it had not ended the battle. The wagon box fight had shifted from a dynamic clash of shock tactics to a grueling siege. The soldiers settled in. They adjusted their positions on the grain sacks. They narrowed their eyes. They knew that the wall they had built with their rifles had to be maintained. If the fire slackened for even a minute, the ocean of warriors outside would crash over them and drown them all. The smell of the battlefield drifted into the corral. It was the scent of death, raw, metallic, and undeniable. It mixed with the smell of the pine wood and the gun smoke. It was the smell of August 2nd, 1867. It was a smell that none of the 32 men would ever forget. They were alive, they were armed, and they were surrounded. The test of the breech loaders was over. The test of endurance was just beginning. The sun reached its zenith directly overhead, transforming the high plateau of Piney Island into an anvil of heat. It was 12 o'clock. The adrenaline that had sustained the defenders through the initial violent onslaught began to drain away, leaving behind a crushing physical exhaustion. The wooden oval of the wagon box corral, which had served as a fortress against the charge, now acted as a kiln. The thick oak planks absorbed the solar radiation, and trapped the body heat of the 32 men huddled inside, raising the ambient temperature within the enclosure well above 100 degrees. The air was still and heavy, sitting on the meadow like a physical weight that pressed against the chest. There was no breeze to sweep away the lingering nitrates from the black powder or the dust that hung in suspension. Captain James Powell removed his hat to wipe the sweat that streamed down his forehead and into his eyes. The salt stung his vision, blurring the shapes of the distant ridges. He looked at his men. They were unrecognizable as the crisp soldiers who had marched out of Fort Phil Kearny 2 days prior. Their faces were masks of black grime, streaked with white channels where the sweat had cut through the powder residue. Their lips were cracked and bleeding from the dryness. Their wool uniforms, designed for the erratic weather of the northern plains but unsuited for this furnace, were dark with perspiration. They panted like dogs, their mouths hanging open to pull in the hot, dry air. The nature of the battle had shifted from the frantic, high-intensity shock of the mounted charge to a slow, grinding ordeal of attrition. The Sioux and Cheyenne, having learned the lethal lesson of the breech loaders, changed their tactics. They abandoned the open field and melted into the terrain. The deep ravines and eroded gullies that surrounded the camp to the north and west offered perfect cover. Hundreds of warriors dismounted and crept into these natural trenches, moving closer to the corral while remaining completely invisible to the soldiers. They worked their way up the slopes using tufts of sagebrush and folds in the earth to conceal their movements. At 12:30, the sniping began in earnest. It was not a volley, but a constant, irregular rhythm of individual shots. A puff of smoke would blossom from a clump of grass 300 yards away, followed instantly by the thwack of a heavy ball striking the wagon boxes. The warriors were armed with a variety of weapons, from trade muskets to captured military rifles, and many were excellent marksmen. They targeted the loopholes and the gaps between the wagon boxes. The soldiers could not show their heads above the rim of the boxes without inviting instant death. They were forced to keep low, pressing their cheeks against the rough grain sacks, peering through the narrow apertures they had bored in the wood. The sound of the bullets striking the corral was terrifying. The heavy projectiles slammed into the oak with a violence that shook the entire structure. Splinters of wood, sharp as needles, sprayed into the faces of the defenders. A soldier near the center of the oval flinched as a ball punched through the side of his wagon box, losing most of its energy in the thick timber but still possessing enough force to bruise his arm. He cursed, shifting his position, but there was nowhere to go. The corral was only 40 feet long and roughly 20 feet wide. It was a cage. The thirst became a torment. The water barrels were located in the center of the oval, exposed to the plunging fire from the high ground. To reach them, a man had to crawl on his belly, exposing himself to the high arcing arrows that continued to fall into the perimeter. The water itself was warm and tasted of the wood of the casks, but it was the only relief available. Men took turns slithering to the barrels, filling a single tin cup and passing it down the line. They rationed it by the sip, wetting their swollen tongues just enough to be able to swallow. The dehydration was accelerated by the intense heat and the chemical dryness of the gunpowder smoke they were inhaling with every breath. At 1 o'clock, the warriors escalated the environmental warfare. A group of braves managed to crawl close enough to the piles of hay and manure near the livestock corral to set them alight. The dry fodder caught instantly. A thick, oily smoke billowed up, darker and more pungent than the gun smoke. The wind, which had been non-existent, shifted slightly, pushing the black cloud directly over the wagon box corral. The smoke rolled over the defenders in a choking wave. It burned the lungs and watered the eyes, reducing visibility to a few yards. The soldiers coughed and gagged, burying their faces in their neckerchiefs or the crooks of their arms. The smoke provided cover for the enemy, allowing them to creep even closer, but it also blinded the riflemen inside the oval. Powell ordered the men to hold their fire unless they had a clear target. He knew they could not afford to waste ammunition shooting at shadows in the haze. The waiting was agony. Every man knew that the warriors were out there, moving in the smoke, closing the distance with their knives and clubs. The imagination filled the gray void with terrors that were almost worse than the reality. The heat of the rifles added to the misery. The Model 1866 Springfields were rugged weapons, but they were not designed for sustained rapid fire over several hours. The barrels were searing hot, blistering the skin of any man careless enough to touch the metal. The heat expanded the steel, making the actions tight. The copper casings of the cartridges, soft to begin with, began to swell in the heated chambers. The extractors, simple mechanisms relying on a spring, began to fail. A soldier would fire, flip the latch, and the block would open, but the spent casing would remain stuck fast in the breech. "Knife!" a private shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He dropped his rifle to the blanket, digging into his belt for his pocket knife. He pried at the rim of the stuck cartridge, the tip of the blade slipping on the copper. His hands shook. Outside, a warrior fired at his loophole, the bullet chewing up the wood inches from his face. He cursed, sweating, digging until the casing finally popped loose. He grabbed a fresh round, shoved it in, and fired again. This scene played out up and down the line. The technological advantage of the breech loaders was balanced by the physical limitations of the materials under stress. The flies arrived in legions, attracted by the blood of the dead horses and the open latrine trenches that the men were forced to use within the confined space. Great swarms of blowflies and biting horseflies descended on the corral. They landed on the faces of the soldiers, crawling into the corners of their eyes and mouths. The men could not spare a hand to swat them away. Their hands were occupied with the rifles. They shook their heads violently, trying to dislodge the insects, but the flies were persistent. The buzzing combined with the cracking of rifles and the shouting of the warriors to create a discordant soundtrack of hell. Daly, the teamster with the Spencer carbine, sat near the western gap, his back against a sack of corn. He had ceased firing for the moment, conserving his ammunition. He watched a particular clump of sagebrush on the slope. He had seen it move against the wind. He waited, the sweat dripping from his nose onto the stock of his weapon. A warrior raised his head from behind the bush, sighting a musket. Daly did not hesitate. He snapped the carbine up and fired. The heavy rimfire slug cut through the brush. The warrior slumped forward, his weapon falling from his hands. Daly lowered the carbine and spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. It was a grim game of patience. The psychological strain of the siege began to weigh on the younger recruits. They had expected a battle to be a flurry of action followed by victory or defeat. They were not prepared for this hours-long standoff where death came anonymously from a distance. They saw the bodies of the horses bloating in the sun, their legs sticking up stiffly. They smelled the stench of the bowels of the animals that had been torn open by bullets. They heard the cries of the wounded soldiers who had been hit in the initial ambush and were still lying out in the field, beyond help. The warriors taunted them, calling out in broken English, telling them they were going to die, that their scalps would dry in the smoke of the lodge fires. Powell moved constantly. He checked the ammunition reserves. They were holding out, but the piles of cartridges were shrinking. He checked the men. He saw the glaze in their eyes, the symptom of heat exhaustion and shock. He spoke to them, keeping his voice low and factual. "Drink some water," he said to a man whose hands were trembling uncontrollably. "Check your sights. Keep the barrel clean." He did not offer false hope. He offered tasks. Work was the antidote to panic. By focusing on the mechanics of the rifle and the geometry of the perimeter, he kept their minds off the inevitability of their situation. At 2 o'clock, the sun seemed to pause in the sky, refusing to descend. The intensity of the light was blinding. The glare reflected off the light-colored clay of the ground and the white canvas of the grain sacks, stabbing into the optic nerves. The soldiers squinted, their eyes reduced to slits. The heat shimmer on the horizon made the distant mountains look like fluid mirages. The world outside the corral dissolved into a blur of heat and pain. The sniping from the ravines intensified. The warriors had established a crossfire. Bullets were now coming from three sides, crisscrossing the interior of the oval. A soldier named Condon was hit. He had raised himself slightly to get a better angle on a target. A bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell back onto the wagon bed, clutching the wound. The blood bright red against the dirty blue of his shirt. A comrade pulled him down, pressing a compress against the hole. Condon groaned, his face turning the color of ash. There was no doctor. There was no morphine. He was given a sip of water and told to lie still. The injury to Condon sent a ripple of cold fear through the oval. It proved that the wagon boxes were not invulnerable. The wood could be penetrated. The angles could be exploited. The men huddled lower, pressing themselves into the earth and the grain sacks. They felt naked, exposed. The illusion of safety provided by the walls began to fracture. They were 32 soft bodies in a wooden box surrounded by 1,000 hard men who wanted them dead. The warriors began to shoot fire arrows. These were arrows wrapped in tow or grass, soaked in grease, and lit before being launched. They arched high into the blue sky, trailing thin lines of gray smoke, and fell toward the corral. The intent was to set the wagon boxes or the grain sacks on fire. If the corral burned, the soldiers would be forced out into the open. The first few arrows landed in the dirt inside the oval, sizzling harmlessly. One landed on a blanket, instantly igniting the wool. A soldier stomped it out with his boot, cursing. "Watch for the fire," Powell ordered. "Stomp them out. Don't let them catch." The men had to divide their attention between the perimeter and the interior. They watched the sky for the falling brands while keeping one eye on the loopholes. It was a dual threat that stretched their nerves to the breaking point. The smell of burning wool added to the sensory assault. The soldiers were fighting the Sioux, the sun, the thirst, and now the fire. At 2:30, the firing from the ridges slackened again. The warriors were regrouping. The silence that followed was suspicious. The soldiers knew by now that silence meant movement. The enemy was shifting, trying a new angle, bringing up more men. Powell used the lull to assess the water situation. The barrels were nearly empty. The heat had evaporated much of what hadn't been drunk. The realization that they might run out of water before they ran out of ammunition was a terrifying thought. The ground inside the wagon boxes was littered with thousands of spent casings. They crunched under the boots of the men. The copper carpet was a testament to the volume of fire they had sustained. Each casing represented a second of life bought with technology. The soldiers looked at the piles of brass and felt a strange affection for the metal. It was the only thing keeping the Stone Age weapons outside from closing the distance. A young private, his face caked in dust, looked up at the sky. "Why doesn't it go down?" he whispered, staring at the sun. "Why doesn't it just go down?" The sun was indifferent. It burned with a relentless nuclear fury. It baked the moisture out of their bodies and the hope out of their hearts. The day was only half over. The shadows were still short. The long afternoon stretched out before them like a desert. They had to endure. They had to keep the breech blocks flipping. They had to keep the hammers falling. Powell looked through his field glasses, scanning the ravine to the west. He saw the tops of the sagebrush moving against the wind. He saw the glint of sunlight on metal. They were massing again. Not for a mounted charge and not just for sniping. They were gathering in the deep cut of the earth, hundreds of them preparing to rush the corral on foot. They were going to try to overwhelm the rifles with sheer numbers to sprint the short distance from the ravine to the wall before the soldiers could reload enough times to stop them. "Get ready," Powell said, his voice raspy from the smoke. "They are bunching up in the ravine, checking your loads. Fill your magazines." The men checked their weapons. They wiped the sweat from their palms. They took a final sip of the warm, woody water. They set their jaws. The sniping phase was ending. The assault was coming back. The heat beat down on their backs, a heavy hand pushing them toward the earth, but they did not break. They were the iron men in the wooden boxes, and they would hold the line until the sun went down or the ammunition ran dry. The siege of the Wagon Box Corral entered its 5th hour as the sun began its slow descent into the western quadrant of the sky. The intense, blinding whiteness of noon had softened only slightly into a harsh yellow glare that cast deep, sharp shadows inside the wooden oval. The temperature remained oppressive, baking the moisture out of the earth and the men who lay upon it. Inside the perimeter, the situation had stabilized into a deadly routine of observation and reaction. The initial panic of the morning had been cauterized by the heat and the constant presence of death, replaced by a numb, mechanical functioning. The soldiers of Company C were no longer thinking of the fort or rescue or the next day. Their world had shrunk to the narrow aperture of the loopholes and the patch of ground directly in front of their rifles. The warriors in the ravines had changed their approach. They realized that the bad medicine of the rapid-fire rifles made open charges suicidal, so they applied the patience of the hunter. They crawled through the tall grass, pushing their bodies flat against the clay, inching closer with every lull in the firing. They utilized the terrain with a mastery that the soldiers could only envy. A warrior would slide into a shallow depression 50 yards closer, waiting for 10 minutes without moving a muscle, until a soldier inside the corral relaxed his vigilance. Then the warrior would rise, fire a snapshot, and drop back into cover before the return fire could locate him. This creeping constriction of the perimeter placed an immense psychological burden on the defenders. The enemy was no longer a distant wave. They were becoming individual faces seen through the smoke. Lieutenant John Jennis commanded the northern sector of the corral. He was a capable officer, well liked by the enlisted men for his fairness and his refusal to shirk the hardships of the frontier duty. Throughout the fight, he had been a source of stability. He moved among the men, checking their ammunition supplies, ensuring their sights were adjusted, and offering quiet words of encouragement. He did not crouch as low as the others. He felt the burden of his rank required him to see more, to anticipate the movements of the enemy, and to show his men that he was not afraid. He stood frequently to use his field glasses, scanning the gullies where the mini-conjus were massing. The wagon boxes on the northern side were perforated with bullet holes. The heavy projectiles from the trade muskets and captured rifles slammed into the oak planks with a rhythmic violence. Splinters flew constantly, small wooden daggers that embedded themselves in the uniforms and skin of the soldiers. Jennis wiped a smear of blood from his cheek where a splinter had grazed him earlier. He did not seem to notice the injury. His focus was entirely on the ravine that ran parallel to his sector. He could see the tops of the sagebrush, twitching against the wind, a sure sign of human movement. "Keep your eyes on that wash," Jennis told a private named Deming. "They are filtering in there. They are going to try to rush us from the low ground." Deming nodded, his face pale beneath the grime. He flinched as a bullet struck the iron rim of the wagon wheel next to his head, sending a spray of sparks and hot metal fragments into the air. "They are getting close, Lieutenant," Deming said, his voice raspy. "Damned close." Jennis straightened up slightly to get a better angle over the rim of the box. He needed to verify the depth of the enemy concentration. An old veteran sergeant crouched nearby saw the officer expose his head and shoulders above the line of the wood. "Best keep down, Lieutenant," the sergeant raspy. They have the range now. They are watching for the officers. Janice glanced at the sergeant and gave a tight, grim smile. I have to see them to fight them, Sergeant, he replied. He raised the field, glasses to his eyes again. It was a calculated risk. The smoke from the previous volleys had drifted, leaving the air momentarily clear. The warriors in the grass saw the blue of the officer's coat and the glint of the brass binoculars. A heavy-caliber rifle cracked from a position less than 80 yards away. There was no scream. There was no dramatic flailing of arms. The sound of the impact was a wet, heavy thud that was audible over the sporadic gunfire. Lieutenant Janice stiffened as if he had been struck by an invisible hammer. The heavy, soft metal ball struck him in the head. He dropped the field glasses, his hands going limp at his sides. He fell backward, his body twisting slightly as he collapsed onto the hard-packed dirt of the corral floor. He did not move. He did not speak. The men in the immediate vicinity stopped firing. For a second, the shock paralyzed them. They stared at the body of their lieutenant. The blood began to pool quickly, dark and viscous in the dust. The reality of the command structure dissolving hit them harder than the heat. Janice had been the voice of authority on this flank. Now he was gone, erased in a fraction of a second by a marksman in the grass. Captain Powell, positioned at the eastern end of the oval, saw the commotion. He did not run. Running would incite panic. He moved quickly and low, crouching below the level of the wagon sides. He reached the spot where Janice lay. He looked at the wound and knew instantly that there was nothing to be done. He placed a hand on the lieutenant's chest for a brief moment, a silent farewell to a brother officer. And then he stood up. Not fully, but enough to be seen by the men. "Cover your front," Powell ordered, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Eyes on the ravine, do not look at him, look at them." The command snapped the soldiers back to reality. They turned their faces away from the dead officer and back to the loopholes. Anger replaced the shock. It was a cold, hard rage. They slammed fresh cartridges into their Springfields with unnecessary force. They wanted to kill. They wanted to make the unseen marksman pay for Janice. The rate of fire from the northern sector increased instantly. The soldiers began to sweep the grass with bullets, churning up the earth where they suspected the sniper was hiding. The warriors, sensing the disruption caused by the hit, raised a cheer. They knew they had struck a leader. A group of young braves rose from the grass, waving their weapons and shouting insults. They thought the morale of the defenders would break. They surged forward, trying to close the distance to 50 yards. "Let them have it," a corporal shouted. The Springfields roared. The brave who had led the surge was hit mid-stride, his body jerking violently as 350 caliber slugs took him in the chest. He fell face forward. The others scrambled back into the cover of the ravine, dragging their wounded with them. The retaliation was swift and brutal. The soldiers were not firing for suppression anymore. They were firing for vengeance. The death of Janice changed the atmosphere inside the corral. The illusion of the officer's invulnerability was shattered. If the lieutenant could be killed, any of them could be next. The men huddled closer to the ground. They piled the grain sacks higher, narrowing the loopholes until they were barely wide enough for the rifle barrels. They became hyper-aware of the angles of fire. They watched the distant puffs of smoke with a predatory intensity, timing their own shots to coincide with the enemy's exposure. The body of the lieutenant lay where it had fallen. There was no time to move him, and nowhere to move him to. The wagon box corral was too small. The living had to fight over the bodies of the dead. The soldiers stepped carefully around him as they moved to retrieve ammunition boxes. It was a grim reminder of their mortality, a silent companion in the crowded space. The flies, which had been plaguing the wounded, now settled on the fallen officer. It was a desecration that made the men grind their teeth, but they could not spare a hand to wave them away. Powell took over the direct command of the northern sector himself. He knew that this was the most dangerous point of the perimeter. The ravine allowed the enemy to approach closer here than anywhere else. He moved from man to man, adjusting their fire. He saw that the barrels of the rifles were fouling from the heavy use. The black powder residue was building up in the grooves, making it harder to load. "Clean them if you have to," Powell instructed. "One man fires, the other cleans. Do not let the actions freeze." The men worked in pairs. One would keep up a steady fire while the other used a rag and a little precious water to wipe out the breach in the chamber. The steam rose from the hot metal as the water hit it. They worked with the desperation of men who knew that their rifle was the only thing keeping them alive. The mechanical reliability of the weapon was more important than their own comfort. The sniping continued throughout the hour. The warriors were relentless. They had plenty of ammunition and time. They chipped away at the wooden walls, testing the resolve of the defenders. A bullet struck a sack of corn, bursting the burlap and sending a stream of yellow kernels spilling onto the ground. Another round hit the stock of a soldier's rifle, shattering the wood and sending splinters into his hand. He wrapped a handkerchief around the bleeding hand and kept firing. The sun moved lower, casting the interior of the ravine in shadow while the corral remained in the spotlight. This gave the advantage to the enemy. They could see into the oval while the soldiers had to peer into the gloom of the earth. Powell realized the danger. He ordered the men to fire low, to skim the top of the grass. "Keep their heads down," he said. "Do not let them aim." The thirst returned, with a vengeance. The adrenaline spike from the officer's death had burned off the remaining moisture in their bodies. Tongues felt like dry leather. Swallowing was painful. The water barrels were agonizingly close, but moving to them was still a gamble with death. A private named Haggerty, the old frontiersman, took a swig from his canteen and offered it to the young soldier next to him. "Take a sup, lad," Haggerty said. "It helps the aim." The boy took the canteen, his hands shaking. He drank and handed it back. He looked at the body of Jenness. "He was a good man," the boy whispered. "He was," Haggerty agreed, chambering around. "Now make sure he didn't die for nothing." The conversation was brief. There was no energy for eulogies. The dialogue of the afternoon was spoken in caliber 50-70. The thump-crack of the rifles was the only language that mattered. The pile of spent casings grew higher, covering the boots of the dead lieutenant. The copper brass was a metallic shroud. As 3 o'clock approached, the volume of fire from the ravine began to build again. The warriors were not just sniping, they were providing covering fire. Powell sensed the shift. He looked at the slopes and saw movement on a larger scale. The individual crawlers were coalescing into groups again. They were preparing for something bigger than harassment. The death of Jenness had been a probing attack, a test of the defenses. Now that they had removed one of the chiefs of the Bluecoats, the warriors were emboldened. They believed the resolve of the soldiers was cracking. They began to sing their war songs again, the eerie, rhythmic chanting drifting up from the gullies. It was a psychological weapon, designed to terrorize the survivors. Powell listened to the singing. He knew what it meant. They were working themselves up for another assault. They were calling on their spirits to protect them from the bullets. He checked his revolver. He checked the line. "Stay sharp," Powell warned. "They are done playing games. They are coming back." The men tightened their grips. The anger over Jenness hardened into a cold resolve. They were not going to break. They were going to kill everyone who came out of that ravine. The death of the lieutenant had not weakened the line. It had calcified it. The wagon box corral was no longer just a defensive position. It was a shrine to their fallen, and they would defend it with a savage piety. The shadows stretched across the meadow, long black fingers reaching for the corral. The heat began to abate slightly, but the intensity of the combat did not. The waiting was over. The warriors in the ravine adjusted their shields and tightened their bowstrings. The final test of the afternoon was assembling in the dark cut of the earth. The soldiers checked their breech blocks one last time. Click, clack, ready. The shadows of the wagon boxes stretched long and distorted across the interior of the corral. Black shapes creeping over the boots of the defenders and the body of Lieutenant Jenness. It was now late afternoon. The sun, while lower in the sky, still possessed a savage intensity that kept the temperature on the high plateau well above comfort levels. The air inside the oval was stagnant, a distinct microclimate formed by the walls of oak and the chemical residue of thousands of burnt cartridges. The soldiers of Company C 26th Infantry sat amidst a carpet of spent copper casings that glittered in the slanting light. They were physically wrecked. Their shoulders were bruised purple from the recoil of the heavy 50-70 rifles. Their ears rang with a permanent tinnitus, a high-pitched whine that masked the subtle sounds of the wind in the grass. Captain James Powell knew that the lull following the death of his lieutenant was not a termination of hostilities, but a pause for reorganization. He watched the deep ravine to the west with the intensity of a man watching a fuse burn down. The topography of Piney Island dictated the flow of the battle. The mounted charges had failed because the horses presented large targets and refused to run into the wall of noise and fire. The sniping had been effective but too slow to dislodge the defenders before nightfall. The Sioux and Cheyenne commanders, veteran strategists who understood the strengths and weaknesses of their enemy, were adapting. They utilized the deep cut of the terrain to mass their forces less than 100 yards from the perimeter, completely shielded from the view of the riflemen. The sound emanating from the ravine was not the chaotic yipping of the morning ambush. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, the sound of hundreds of moccasins stamping the earth, the rustle of trade cloth, and the murmur of many voices preparing for death. The warriors were stripping for the final effort. They removed their breastplates of bone and beads, their heavy leggings, and anything that might slow them down or offer a handhold to an enemy. They painted their faces and bodies with the symbols of their medicine, calling on the protection of the spirits. They were transforming themselves from cavalry into light infantry, a force designed to sprint across the open ground and overwhelm the wooden fortress through sheer weight of numbers. Powell moved along the line, stepping over the legs of his men. He did not shout. He spoke in a flat, hard tone that cut through the haze of exhaustion. "They are coming on foot," he stated. "They will try to rush the wall. Do not fire until you see the paint on their chests. Make every shot a kill. If they get to the boxes, use your revolvers. If the revolvers run dry, use the bayonet." He checked the locking mechanism of his own weapon. He verified that the crates of reserve ammunition were open and positioned for rapid distribution. He looked at the civilians, the teamsters who had fought alongside the soldiers all day. They were grim, their faces set in lines of fatalistic determination. They knew that if the perimeter was breached, there would be no quarter. The buildup in the ravine reached a critical mass. The sheer number of warriors packed into the depression was staggering. Estimates would later place the force at several hundred men, the elite of the fighting societies. They were crowded shoulder to shoulder, a coiled spring of human aggression waiting for the signal. The leaders moved among them, exhorting them to courage, reminding them of the Sand Creek massacre, of the encroachment on their hunting grounds, of the need to wipe out this island of invaders. The energy in the ravine was palpable, a vibration that traveled through the ground and into the soles of the soldiers' boots. Then the edge of the ravine seemed to boil over. There was no preliminary shout, no warning shot. The warriors surged up the slope in a solid, unified mass. They did not run in a straight line. They moved in a jagged, weaving pattern designed to throw off the aim of the riflemen. They came fast, their bodies low to the ground, weapons held ready. It was a terrifying sight. A human wave painted in red and yellow, bristling with lances and clubs, rushing toward the corral with a speed that defied the exhaustion of the day. The ground did not shake as it had with the horses. Instead, there was the dry, rushing sound of hundreds of feet tearing through the sagebrush, like the sound of a flash flood moving down a dry creek bed. Fire! Powell's command was instantaneous. The west face of the wagon box corral erupted. The volley was not ragged this time. It was a simultaneous explosion of 30 rifles. The effect was horrifyingly visible. The front rank of the charging warriors simply disintegrated. The heavy slugs, traveling at high velocity, punched through bodies, shattering the momentum of the run. Men were lifted off their feet and thrown backward into the men behind them. The charge did not stop, but it stuttered, a ripple of confusion passing through the mass as the first wave collided with the wall of metal. The soldiers did not pause to admire their work. They worked the actions of the Springfields with a frantic speed. Flip, eject, load, snap, fire. The cycle time was reduced to seconds. The heat from the barrels became searing, burning the hands of the men even through the rags they used for protection. The air in front of the corral turned into a gray fog of smoke, but the warriors were so close that the soldiers could see the dark shapes looming through the haze. They fired at the center of mass, at the torsos that filled their sights. They did not aim at individuals, they aimed at the crowd. The warriors pressed the attack with a relentless ferocity. They knew that they had to cross the zone of fire before the soldiers could reload enough times to stop them. They screamed as they ran, a high, piercing war cry that chilled the blood. They leaped over the bodies of their fallen comrades, vaulting the sagebrush, closing the distance to 60 yards, then 50, then 40. The arrows began to fall again, not in high arcs, but in flat, driving trajectories. They thudded into the wagon boxes, vibrating like tuning forks. They slipped through the loopholes, striking the grain sacks and the blankets. Private Condon, already wounded, loaded rifles for the man next to him. His hands were slick with his own blood, but he kept shoving cartridges into the breeches. "Here," he shouted, handing a loaded weapon to the marksman. "Give them hell." The marksman, a corporal named Grady, fired, dropped the empty rifle, grabbed the fresh one, and fired again. This two-man team tactic effectively doubled the rate of fire for that position. It was a factory of death operating at peak efficiency. The sheer density of the target area meant that even shots that missed the intended warrior often struck the man behind him. The 50 caliber projectiles designed to stop a charging cavalry horse caused devastating wounds. A warrior hit in the arm would have the limb shattered. A hit in the leg resulted in an amputation by impact. The ground in front of the corral became a slick, bloody abattoir. The dust mixed with the fluids of the fallen to create a red mud that slowed the advance of the rear ranks. Daly, the civilian with the Spencer carbine, stood up to fire over the top of the wagon box. He knew the risk, but he needed the clear field of fire. He pumped the lever of his weapon, spraying 7 shots in 7 seconds into the closest group of attackers. A warrior armed with a tomahawk hurled the weapon at him. The axe spun through the air, striking the side of the wagon box inches below Daly's chest, embedding itself deep in the oak. Daly flinched but didn't stop firing until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. He dropped below the rim to reload, his hands trembling as he fed the copper tubes into the stock. The old frontiersman Haggerty was using a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot. He waited until a group of warriors reached the 30-yard line, a distance where the spread of the shot would be most lethal. He rose, leveled the heavy barrels, and fired both triggers at once. The blast was deafening. The cloud of heavy balls swept a 10-foot section of the grass clear of life. 3 warriors went down in a heap. Haggerty ducked back down, broke the action, and coolly reloaded, blowing the smoke out of the barrels before inserting fresh paper shells. The pressure on the perimeter was immense. The warriors were now close enough that the soldiers could see the whites of their eyes, the sweat on their skin, and the expressions of rage and pain. The smell of the attacking force, sage, bear grease, and sweat, drifted into the corral, mixing with the smell of the gunpowder. It was an intimate, visceral proximity. The abstraction of long-range combat was gone. This was a brawl. A warrior possessed by a desperate courage made it all the way to the wagon boxes. He threw himself against the wood, grabbing the barrel of a rifle that protruded from a loophole. He tried to wrench the weapon from the soldier's grasp. The soldier, a young private, screamed and pulled back. The tug-of-war lasted for a second before the soldier let go of the rifle with one hand, drew his revolver, and fired blindly through the loophole. The warrior grunted and fell away, clutching his chest. The rifle was pulled back inside, the barrel bent slightly from the struggle. The V formation of the charge, intended to pierce the center of the line, stalled at 20 yards. The pile of bodies in front of the corral had become a physical barricade, a grisly rampart that the following warriors had to climb over. The momentum was gone. The wall of fire generated by the breech loaders was simply too thick to penetrate. Flesh and bone could not stand against the continuous stream of heavy metal. The warriors in the front rank, seeing that they could not breach the wall, began to falter. They stopped running and started looking for cover. This hesitation was fatal. The soldiers, sensing the break in the momentum, redoubled their efforts. They poured a withering fire into the stationary targets. The noise was a solid wall of sound. There was no individual gunshot anymore. It was a continuous rolling roar. The smoke was so thick that the soldiers were firing at muzzle flashes and shapes. The heat inside the wagon boxes was infernal, a suffocating blanket that wrapped around the men, but they did not stop. They were fighting for their scalps. The charge broke. It did not end with a formal retreat. It ended with a dissolution of will. The warriors realized that the medicine of the white men was too strong. They turned and ran. They ran back toward the ravine, back toward the safety of the earth. The retreat was as chaotic as the advance. Men limped, crawled, and dragged their wounded comrades. The soldiers kept firing, striking the retreating figures in the back, ensuring that they would not turn around. As the last of the warriors disappeared over the lip of the ravine, the firing slowly sputtered out. One by one, the rifles fell silent. The smoke hung low over the field, motionless in the still air. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void was sudden and heavy. It was broken only by the racking coughs of the soldiers and the cries of the wounded on the slope. Powell looked over the rim of the box. The scene before him was a testament to the brutality of the engagement. The grass for 50 yards in front of the corral was trampled flat. The bodies lay in heaps, tangled together in the final embrace of death. The sheer number of fallen enemies was staggering. It was a slaughter. The technological advantage of the Allen conversion rifles had turned a desperate last stand into a decisive defensive victory. Inside the corral, the men collapsed. They slid down the sides of the wagon boxes, sitting in the dirt, their chests heaving. They dropped their rifles, their hands too cramped to hold them. They looked at their blistered fingers, at the soot that covered their arms. They were dehydrated, deafened, and traumatized. They stared at the blue sky, unable to comprehend that they were still alive. "Check the ammunition," Powell croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The sergeants moved sluggishly to obey. They counted the remaining crates. They had burned through thousands of rounds. The piles of empty casings were ankle-deep in some places. They still had enough for another fight, but the barrels of the rifles were in dangerous condition. The fouling was thick, caked into the rifling. The actions were sticky. If the enemy came again immediately, the guns might fail. The soldiers began the process of cleaning their weapons again. It was a robotic, joyless task. They poured the last dregs of their warm water down the barrels. They scrubbed the chambers. They oiled the latches. They did not speak of the victory. There was no cheering. There was only the grim satisfaction of survival. They looked at the body of Lieutenant Jenness and felt a heavy, dull sorrow. He had missed the repulse of the charge. The sun touched the top of the western mountains. The light turned golden, bathing the bloody field in a surreal, beautiful glow. The heat began to dissipate, replaced by the first hint of the evening chill. The foot charge had been the hammer blow, the maximum effort of the Sioux nation to crush the invaders. It had failed. The wagon box corral still stood. The iron circle remained unbroken, but the day was not over. The warriors were still there in the ravine, licking their wounds. The soldiers knew that the night would bring new terrors. Darkness would negate their range advantage. If the enemy attacked in the dark, the rifles would be useless until the hatchets were hacking at the wood. The soldiers watched the sun go down with a mixture of relief and dread. They had survived the fire, but they now had to survive the dark. The repulse of the massive foot charge did not bring silence to the Piney Island plateau, but rather a shift in the acoustic texture of the battle. The deafening, rolling thunder of the volley fire was replaced by a jagged, sporadic rhythm of individual gunshots that echoed flatly against the distant granite walls of the Bighorn Mountains. It was now late afternoon, approaching 4 o'clock. The sun, which had been the primary antagonist for much of the day, began to lose its harsh vertical dominance, slanting its rays from the west. This change in angle offered no relief to the men trapped inside the wagon box corral. Instead, it blinded them. The soldiers on the western perimeter were forced to squint directly into the glare, their pupils contracting painfully as they tried to pick out targets against the backlit terrain where the enemy lay in wait. Captain James Powell remained crouched near the center of the oval, his boots resting on a layer of spent copper casings that shifted like gravel with every movement. He wiped a mixture of grease and soot from the mechanism of his Springfield rifle, his fingers moving with the stiff, clumsy articulation of extreme fatigue. The victory against the foot charge had been decisive, yet it had depleted their physical reserves to a dangerous level. The men were shaking. It was not the tremors of fear that had plagued them in the morning, but the uncontrollable muscular spasms of bodies pushed beyond their caloric and hydration limits. Their canteens were dry. The water barrels were empty, the wood staves drying out and shrinking in the heat. The thirst was a physical torture, swelling tongues until they filled the mouth, making speech difficult and swallowing impossible. The warriors in the ravine had not fled the field. They had merely retreated below the lip of the earth to regroup and assess the carnage. The space between the corral and the drop-off was a landscape of devastation, littered with the bodies of the fallen and the carcasses of horses that had bloated rapidly in the heat. The smell was dense and cloying, a mixture of iron-rich blood, released bowels, and the sulphurous stench of black powder that hung low in the stagnant air. The Sioux and Cheyenne sharpshooters, realizing that a direct assault was too costly, returned to their earlier tactic of suppression. They crawled up to the very edge of the ravine, pushing their rifles through the sagebrush, and poured a steady, harassing fire into the wooden walls of the fortification. Private Doyle, whose shoulder was turning a deep, mottled purple from the recoil of his weapon, rested his forehead against the rough oak of the wagon box. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, his mind foggy from the fumes and the heat. A bullet slammed into the outer planking inches from his face, spraying sawdust into his hair. The impact acted as a stimulant. He jerked his head up, blinked the grit from his eyes, and shoved another cartridge into the breech. There was no option to rest. If they stopped firing, the warriors would crawl forward. If the warriors crawled forward, they would be overrun. The perimeter was held not by stone or earth, but by the volume of fire. The ammunition supply became the primary concern for the command. Powell ordered a consolidation of the remaining rounds. Men crawled from box to box, dragging the heavy crates with them. They poured the remaining packets of 50-70 cartridges onto blankets, counting them with their eyes. The piles were smaller now. They had expended thousands of rounds in the last 6 hours. They had enough for perhaps one more major assault or 2 hours of sustained sniping. After that, they would be reduced to their revolvers and knives. The reality of their logistical limit sat heavy in the pit of their stomachs. At 4:30, the nature of the enemy movement changed again. The warriors began to risk exposure to retrieve their dead and wounded. It was a sacred duty, a cultural imperative that superseded personal safety. Pairs of warriors would sprint from the cover of the ravine, grab the arms of a fallen comrade, and drag him back toward safety. The soldiers faced a grim moral calculus. In a civilized war, one might hold fire. Here there was no such luxury. Every live warrior was a threat, and a wounded man recovered could fight again another day. Powell gave the order to maintain fire. The soldiers targeted the rescue parties. It was brutal, ugly work. The heavy slugs tore through the grass, kicking up spurts of dust, striking flesh and bone. The cries of the hitmen joined the chorus of the afternoon. The shadows inside the corral grew longer, stretching across the dirt floor like bars of a prison cell. The isolation felt absolute. Fort Phil Kearny was only 6 miles away, a distance that could be covered in an hour on a good horse, yet it felt as if it were on another continent. The soldiers had heard no signals, seen no dust cloud on the eastern horizon. They began to believe they had been written off, sacrificed to buy time for the garrison. The bitterness of this thought added a sharp edge to their exhaustion. They were 32 men alone in the center of the Sioux Nation. Suddenly, the warriors on the northern slope ceased firing. The drop in volume was noticeable instantly. The soldiers tensed, expecting a trick. They gripped their rifles harder, their knuckles white. But the warriors were not looking at the corral. They were looking toward the east. A commotion rippled through the enemy lines. Riders on the high ridges turned their ponies and began to gesture frantically with their bows. The men in the wagon boxes could not see what was happening behind the hills that blocked their view of the road to the fort. They could only see the reaction of the enemy. Then a sound cut through the heavy air. A sound distinct from the sharp crack of rifles or the dull thud of arrows. It was a deep, resonant boom, low and throaty, that vibrated in the chest. "Listen!" Haggerty, the old frontiersman, hissed, lifting his head. A few seconds later, a second boom rolled across the landscape. It was the undeniable voice of a mountain howitzer. The soldiers looked at each other, their cracked lips splitting into wide, incredulous grins. The artillery meant only one thing: the relief column. The army did not send out patrols with cannons. They sent out armies with cannons. On the high ridge to the east, a puff of white smoke appeared against the blue sky, followed by the screeching whistle of a shell arching over the valley. The projectile flew high over the wagon box corral, a dark blur against the clouds, and slammed into the cluster of warriors gathering on the western slope. The shell exploded with a sharp, violent crack, throwing dirt and shrapnel into the air. The gun that shoots twice, the Indian name for the explosive shells, had arrived. The effect on the besieging force was immediate panic. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were brave to the point of recklessness when facing small arms, even the new rapid-fire rifles. They could understand a bullet. They could dodge a lance. But artillery was a force of nature they could not counter. The exploding shells turned their cover into a trap. There was no way to hide from a weapon that dropped death from the sky. The concentration of warriors in the ravine, so dangerous a moment ago, began to dissolve. Powell stood up. For the first time in hours, he stood to his full height in the center of the wagon box corral. He raised his field glasses to his eyes, ignoring the stray bullets that still whizzed past. He focused on the eastern ridge. There, cresting the high ground, he saw the most beautiful sight of his life. A long blue line of infantry was deploying into a skirmish formation. The sun glinted off hundreds of bayonets. The regimental colors snapped in the breeze. "It's the relief!" Powell shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "It's Major Smith! They are here!" The men inside the corral tried to cheer, but it came out as a raspy, disjointed croak. Some of them began to weep openly, the tears cutting fresh tracks through the grime on their faces. Others simply sat down hard, the strength finally leaving their legs now that the necessity of standing was gone. They watched as the relief column advanced methodically. The fresh troops moved with precision, stopping to fire volleys that swept the ridges clear. The boom of the howitzer sounded again, walking the shells closer to the retreating warriors. The withdrawal of the Indian army was a spectacle in itself. As the blue column pressed forward, the hillsides seemed to move. Hundreds of ponies and warriors poured out of the ravines and gullies, streaming away toward the mountains. It was a river of retreat. They carried their dead with them, lashed to ponies or dragged on travois. They did not look back. The medicine of the day had turned against them. The combination of the unceasing rifle fire from the boxes and the thunder of the big gun was too much. Major Benjamin Smith, commanding the relief force, rode at the head of the column. He had pushed his men hard. The garrison at the fort had heard the firing since morning, a continuous low rumble that told them a desperate fight was in progress. It had taken time to gather the available men, secure the fort, and hitch the artillery. But once they were moving, they had marched with a singular urgency. Smith scanned the meadow through the smoke. He saw the wagon box corral, a tiny, insignificant-looking pile of wood in the vastness of the plain. He saw the blue haze of powder smoke that still clung to it. He expected to find a slaughterhouse. He expected to find silence. Instead, as the relief column closed to within shouting distance, they saw the heads of the defenders rise above the wagon boxes. Men waved their hats. The skirmishers of the relief force lowered their rifles and broke into a run, rushing toward the corral. The siege was lifted. The iron ring was broken. The link-up was chaotic and emotional. The fresh soldiers vaulted the wagon boxes, gripping the hands of the survivors, slapping them on the backs. They stared at the piles of spent brass that covered the floor of the corral. They looked at the splintered wood of the wagon boxes, which looked as if they had been chewed by giant rats. The sheer volume of fire required to produce such debris was incomprehensible to the new arrivals. Dr. Horton, the post surgeon who had accompanied the relief, immediately scrambled into the corral. He carried his medical bag, looking for the wounded. He found Lieutenant Genes's body covered by a blanket. He moved to Private Condon and the other wounded men, administering water and morphine. The relief troops passed their canteens to the defenders. The water was warm, but to Powell's men it tasted like the sweetest nectar. They drank greedily, the fluid spilling down their chins, washing away the taste of saltpeter and death. Powell met Major Smith near the gate of the corral. The two officers exchanged a salute. Powell was filthy, his uniform torn, his face a mask of black powder. Smith was clean, his uniform pressed. The contrast was stark. "We thought you were gone, James," Smith said quietly, looking around at the carnage. "We heard the firing. It sounded like a general engagement." "We held them off," Powell raspy, his voice a whisper. "They charged us on foot. They charged us on horse. We held them off." Smith looked at the field in front of the corral. Even though the Indians had removed many of their dead, the ground was still thick with the bodies of horses and the debris of the battle. The grass was matted with blood. The stench was overpowering. "My God," Smith murmured. "How many were there?" "Thousands," Powell replied. "Or it felt like it, enough to walk over us if we stopped shooting." The soldiers of the relief column began to secure the perimeter. They pushed out skirmish lines to ensure the enemy was truly gone. They marveled at the wagon boxes. They ran their fingers over the bullet holes. They picked up the spent casings of the 50-70 rounds. They looked at the survivors with a new respect. These 32 men had held off the flower of the Sioux Nation for 6 hours. The tension of the combat began to leave the bodies of the defenders, replaced by a profound, crippling soreness. Now that the adrenaline was gone, the bruises hurt. The burns on their hands throbbed. The ringing in their ears became a roar. They struggled to stand. They had to be helped out of the boxes they had defended so fiercely. They stumbled on the flat ground, their legs accustomed to the cramped crouching of the corral. The sun was now touching the horizon, casting the world in a deep, ruddy twilight. The arrival of the howitzer had been the punctuation mark at the end of a long, bloody sentence. The fight was over. The noise was gone. There was only the sound of men talking in low voices, the clinking of canteens, and the stamping of the artillery horses. Powell looked back at the wagon box corral one last time before moving to the ambulance wagon. The structure looked pathetic in the twilight, just a ring of old wood and canvas. But it had been a fortress. It had been the difference between life and death. He touched the side of a box, feeling the rough grain. It was full of heavy slugs that had failed to penetrate. It had done its job. The relief column began to organize the return march. There was no thought of staying at the pineries. The wood camp was destroyed. The tents were gone. The wagons were burned. The mission to harvest timber was over. The only mission now was to get the survivors back to the walls of Fort Phil Kearny. The dead were loaded into the wagons. Lieutenant Jenness was lifted carefully, wrapped in a fresh blanket. The wounded were placed on stretchers. The sound of the howitzer had signaled life. It had signaled that they were not forgotten. As the twilight deepened into dusk, the column formed up. The fresh troops took the flanks. The survivors walked in the center or rode in the wagons. They turned their backs on Piney Island. They left the dead horses and the blood-soaked grass to the wolves and the night. The boom of the gun still echoed in their minds, a reminder of the moment when the scale tipped back in their favor. They were alive. And for tonight, that was the only victory that was important. The sun dipped below the jagged spine of the Bighorn Mountains, casting the high plateau of Piney Island into a deep, bruised twilight. The temperature dropped rapidly, the heat of the day replaced by the biting chill of the high-altitude evening. Major Benjamin Smith sat on his horse, watching the consolidation of the column. The relief force he commanded formed a protective square around the survivors of the wagon box corral. The order to move out was given not with a bugle call, but with a quiet, urgent circulation of verbal commands passed down the line by the sergeants. The priority was speed and cohesion. The enemy, though pushed back by the artillery, still occupied the high ground in massive numbers. Watching the withdrawal with a sullen, predatory silence, the survivors of Company C stumbled out of the wooden oval that had been their world for the last 6 hours. Walking on the open ground felt unnatural to them. Their legs, cramped from crouching in the dirt, refused to function smoothly. They moved with a stiff, jerking gait, like marionettes with tangled strings. They looked back at the wagon boxes one last time. The structure was a ruin. The heavy oak planks were chewed to splinters by thousands of bullets. The grain sacks were leaking yellow corn onto the blood-soaked earth. It looked less like a fortification and more like a pile of refuse, yet it was the only reason they were drawing breath. They left it there, a silent monument to the violence of the day. They could not take the boxes, the oxen were dead or scattered, and the running gears were burned. The loading of the casualties was a somber process performed with mechanical efficiency. Lieutenant John Jenness, his body wrapped in a gray army blanket, was placed in the bed of an ambulance wagon. The fabric was already darkening with the blood that seeped from his head wound. Private Condon and the other severely wounded men were lifted onto stretchers and slid into the wagons alongside the officer. They groaned as the vehicles shifted, the iron springs creaking under the weight. The teamsters lashed the canvas covers down. There was no room for the uninjured in the wagons. The men who could walk had to walk. Captain James Powell refused to ride. He walked at the head of his shattered company, his revolver still in his hand, though he had holstered it. His face was a mask of black soot and dried sweat, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He checked his men as they fell into formation. They were ghosts in blue wool. Their uniforms were torn, their hands wrapped in bloody rags, their faces caked with dust. They carried their Springfield rifles with a possessive intensity, unwilling to let the weapons out of their grip even for a second. The crates of unspent ammunition were loaded onto the remaining mules. Nothing of value was to be left for the Sioux. The column began to move east, away from the timber and toward the open prairie that led to Fort Phil Kearny. The order of march was strict. A screen of skirmishers from the relief force fanned out ahead and on the flanks, their rifles at the ready. The mountain howitzer, the weapon that had broken the siege, was limbered up and pulled by its team of horses in the center, directly behind the wagons carrying the wounded. The survivors walked in the pocket created by the fresh troops. They were shielded from the view of the ridges, protected by a wall of men who had not spent the day in the oven of the corral. The journey back was a 6-mile gauntlet of nerves. The road was rough, deeply rutted by the wood trains of the previous weeks. The dust kicked up by hundreds of boots hung in the still air, a gray fog that obscured the stars which were just beginning to appear. The noise of the column was a low, grinding dissonance, the clatter of the mule hooves, the screech of the wagon axles, and the rhythmic thud of feet. No one spoke. The banter common to soldiers on the march was absent. The men of Company C were too exhausted to speak, and the men of the relief column were too respectful of the silence to break it. On the ridges to the north and south, the presence of the enemy was a physical weight. The soldiers could not see them in the deepening gloom, but they knew they were there. The scouts reported movement on the skyline, shadows detaching themselves from the rocks and pacing the column. The Sioux and Cheyenne had suffered horrific casualties, but their army was still intact. They watched the bluecoats leave, their anger burning cold in the night. They did not attack. The memory of the exploding shells was too fresh. They respected the gun that shoots twice. They allowed the column to pass, contenting themselves with the knowledge that they had destroyed the wood camp and stopped the timber harvest for the time being. The physical toll of the march on the survivors was excruciating. The adrenaline crash hit them hard a mile out from Piney Island. Their bodies, sustaining high levels of stress for hours, now demanded payment. Muscles seized up. Dehydration caused cramping in the abdomens and legs. Men stumbled in the ruts, catching themselves on the shoulders of their comrades. A young private who had fought like a demon in the corral simply sat down in the road, unable to take another step. Two men from the relief column hauled him up, slinging his arms over their shoulders, and half-carried him the rest of the way. Powell walked with a grim determination. He focused on the lights of the fort, which were not yet visible. He replayed the day in his mind, not as a narrative, but as a series of tactical snapshots. The placement of the wagon boxes, the timing of the volleys, the death of Janice. He knew that the victory was significant. They had faced odds of 30-1 and survived. They had inflicted massive casualties on a force that had wiped out Fetterman's command on this same ground. But the cost of the victory sat heavy on him. The loss of his lieutenant and the trauma inflicted on his men were prices he would have preferred not to pay. As the column crossed the bridge over Big Piney Creek, the sound of the water rushing over the stones was a torment to the thirsty men. They wanted to break ranks and throw themselves into the stream, but the sergeants held the line. "Keep moving," they hissed. "Water at the fort! Keep moving!" To stop now, in the dark, in a depression near the water, was to invite an ambush. The discipline held. The men licked their cracked lips and kept walking, the sound of the water fading behind them as they climbed the slope toward the post. The terrain opened up as they neared the fort. The menacing ridges receded, replaced by the rolling hills of the immediate vicinity of the garrison. The tension in the column began to ease slightly. They were entering the defensive perimeter of the post's heavy guns. The sentries on the walls of Fort Phil Kearny saw the dust cloud in the moonlight long before they heard the wagons. The call went out. "Column approaching. Open the gates." The massive wooden gates of the stockade swung open, revealing the interior of the fort illuminated by torches and lanterns. The entire garrison had turned out to watch the return. They lined the parade ground, silent and anxious. They had listened to the gunfire all day, fearing the worst. When the first skirmishers marched through the gate, a ripple of relief went through the crowd. Then came the wagons with the wounded. Then came the survivors. The sight of Powell's men silenced the garrison. They looked like men who had crawled out of a grave. Their uniforms were black with grime, stiff with dried sweat and blood. Their eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing, locked in the 1,000-yard stare of combat fatigue. They did not cheer. They did not wave. They simply walked, putting one foot in front of the other until the command was given to halt. Colonel Jonathan E. Smith, the post commander, walked out to meet them. He approached Captain Powell, who was standing by his horse, having finally mounted for the entry into the fort. Powell saluted, his hand trembling slightly from exhaustion. "Company C returns, sir." Powell raspy, his voice a dry croak. "We held the position." "At ease, Captain," the colonel replied, returning the salute slowly. "My God, look at you." The dismissal was given, and the structure of the military hierarchy dissolved into humanitarian aid. The men of the garrison rushed forward. They did not ask questions. They offered canteens. They offered shoulders to lean on. The survivors were guided to the barracks, not to their duty stations. The priority was water, food, and sleep. The wounded were taken immediately to the post hospital. Dr. Horton and his staff began the long night of surgery. They removed bullets, stitched lacerations, and set broken bones. Private Condon, pale and weak from blood loss, was placed in a cot. He would live, but his war was over. The body of Lieutenant Jennis was taken to the dead house to be prepared for burial. The reality of his death hit the officers of the post hard. He had been a popular man, a promising soldier cut down in his prime. In the barracks, the survivors of the Wagon Box Fight sat on their bunks, staring at the floor. They drank water by the quart, their bodies soaking it up like dry sponges. The cooks brought in kettles of soup and coffee, but many of the men were too tired to eat. They stripped off their filthy uniforms, peeling the wool from their skin. They washed the soot from their faces and hands, the water in the basins turning black instantly. The most striking behavior was their treatment of the rifles. Even in the safety of the barracks, the men cleaned their weapons before they slept. They sat on their bunks, disassembled the Allen conversions, and scrubbed the barrels until they shone. They wiped down the breech blocks and oiled the springs. These pieces of wood and iron had saved their lives. They had functioned when it mattered. The new technology had passed the ultimate test. The soldiers treated the guns with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Powell sat in his quarters, a cup of whiskey in his hand. He did not drink it immediately. He looked at the map on his desk. He traced the route to Piney Island with his finger. The engagement was over, but the war was not. The Sioux would not forget this day. They had lost hundreds of warriors. The power dynamic of the plains had shifted. The days of the Indians overwhelming soldiers with sheer numbers were ending. The rapid-fire rifle had negated the advantage of the mass charge. The Wagon Box Fight was the proof. Outside, the fort settled into a restless night. The sentries on the walls were doubled. The fear of a retaliatory night attack was high, though unlikely given the losses the enemy had sustained. The moon rose high over the stockade, bathing the wooden walls in a cold white light. The flag, which had been lowered at retreat, was folded and put away. The soldiers of Company C finally slept. It was a deep, coma-like sleep born of total exhaustion. They did not dream of glory. They did not dream of the Medal of Honor, which many of them would later be recommended for. They slept the sleep of men who had looked death in the face for 6 hours and blinked last. The civilians who had fought alongside them were housed in the quartermaster's store. Haggerty, the old frontiersman, cleaned his double-barreled shotgun and reloaded it before lying down. He knew the frontier better than anyone. He knew that survival was a temporary state. Today, they had won. Tomorrow was another problem. He pulled his hat over his eyes and was asleep in seconds. August 3rd, 1867 arrived with the sounding of reveille at dawn. The bugle notes cut through the morning air, sharp and clear. The fort woke up. The survivors of the Wagon Box Fight were exempted from duty. They slept through the call. The rest of the garrison moved quietly around their barracks, lowering their voices. The news of the fight began to spread. The teamsters who had fled to the fort early in the battle told their stories of the ambush. The survivors told their stories of the corral. The numbers began to take shape. 32 men against thousands. It sounded impossible. It sounded like a tall tale. But the piles of spent brass on Piney Island and the empty bunks in the Sioux villages were the hard evidence. Major Smith wrote his report. He detailed the relief column's march, the effectiveness of the howitzer, and the condition of the survivors. He emphasized the discipline of Powell's men. He noted the devastation of the ground around the corral. He recommended citations. The paperwork of war began to pile up, turning the blood and noise of the day into ink and paper for the archives in Washington. The Wagon Box Fight was over. The wood camp at Piney Island was abandoned, the logs left to rot in the sun. But the message had been delivered. The United States Army had a new weapon, and the soldiers knew how to use it. The psychological victory was as important as the tactical one. The fear of the Fetterman fate was diminished. The soldiers knew they could stand and fight, even against overwhelming odds, if they kept their heads and their powder dry. Captain Powell walked out onto the parade ground later that morning. He looked at the flag snapping in the breeze. He looked at the mountains in the distance. He felt the stiffness in his legs and the ringing in his ears. He took a deep breath of the cool air. He was alive. His men were alive. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the western frontier, that was the only sum that balanced the ledger.